Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now, we begin. When I turned 18 and moved to London for university, I promised myself I would never return to Duncraig. I know it sounds dramatic. The statement is one of those adolescent declarations that parents typically dismiss with an eye roll. But I didn't make some grand public pledge like many others do after they've settled into their dormitories. It was a secret, and one I promised myself I'd keep. My parents wouldn't care or call if I never came back. They couldn't call or email. They were old school, a euphemism for being belligerently stubborn to change. But with some of that stubborn blood in me, I figured I had a better chance of sticking to my promise. Of course, I did end up coming home. However, I hope you'll see that it was hard not to go back on my word. After all, it's not every day that Police Scotland rings your mobile like a debt collector and begs you to drop everything to fly across the country. I didn't even pay for my plane ticket. The Highlands Constabulary did. It hardly counts as coming home, you see. The occasion was that they found my family just after I left for university. My mum, dad, and sisters vanished into thin air. They had been missing for an estimated 6 years, though only 5 were confirmed, as it took the village the better part of a year to find out they were missing in the first place. Honestly, I'm a little surprised it didn't take longer. My parents were not friendly people. They weren't particularly mean either, but they didn't have friends and didn't make small talk. They barely even spoke to me. My sisters were older and still lived at home, but by the time I was in secondary school, they were hardly ever around. Ever since I left for university, there had been no trace of them either. Their unnoticed disappearance was aided by the fact that my family lived in a secluded stone manor on the coastal cliffs outside the village. It was a 10,000 square foot monstrosity surrounded by moors and connected to the village road by a half-mile gravel path. It was an ugly, cruel-looking place built of massive blocks of gray stone. Despite being more labyrinth than home, when I was told their bodies had been found inside and were likely there all along, I couldn't speak. Had investigators searched the house? Was there some kind of hidden room no one had known about? Even when they called, telling me they'd found the bodies, I was reluctant to return. Inspector Ross gave me the disturbing details as gently as he could, and I drank throughout the conversation until those details got nice and blurry around the edges. He said if I wasn't going to come back home, to please provide them with the basics. A DNA swab, a written statement, anything that could help. I mailed everything I could in a manila envelope, content to wash my hands of the past. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I folded a few days after mailing everything. I kissed my girlfriend Alois on the cheek and stepped into the security line at Heathrow Airport. Regardless if I returned home, the rumors were finding me across the country anyway. I was ignoring a dozen calls a day from old acquaintances I had hoped to never hear from again. When the bodies were found and the investigation began, all the village gossip regarding my parents' initial disappearance was compiled. The villagers agreed that my parents' car had disappeared the same week I moved out to go to university, but no one had seen them leave. Of course, it was unlikely that their single car departing in the night would be noticed by anyone. The only problem was that the house was empty. There were no furnishings, no porcelain dishes, no tapestries. Everyone agreed it would take a battalion of moving trucks to haul away all the lamps and books and leather armchairs that house must have held. But there were no moving trucks. That would have been noticed. Could it have been emptied by the MacDougalls after they left, carrying one piece at a time, said the police. But the logistics of my parents' belongings didn't concern me. To be honest, when I found out they went missing during the summer before my second year, I felt relief. Now I really would never have to go home. The village didn't have an airport, and it would be more than 2 hours' drive from Inverness. Luckily, I was getting a ride, and I wasn't all that shocked when I was greeted at the terminal by every investigative agent in the county. Unsolved quadruple homicides are few and far between in the Scottish Highlands. Inspector Ross stepped forward. Oliver, he smiled somberly. Hey, Inspector. From my turbulent youth, I knew Inspector Ross personally. After 6 years away, I saw he had become an old man now, though still broad-shouldered and with his signature thick gray beard. He told me after one of my worst nights that landed me in the village lockup that he was on a path to prison too, before getting sober decades before I was born. He shook my hand. I'd shaken it before when I was younger as a deal between would-be degenerates to get my life together. It was firm then. Now his soft, sorry handshake sent shivers down my spine. I moved down the line of faces and shook hands with the county workers I knew from the other roles they played in the village. Dr. Lamont, my pediatrician, Officer MacLeod, my geography teacher. All their hands were limp and feeble on my own. I was the man with the dead family. I was the man made of glass. Don't worry, lad. No reporters, like I promised. I nodded, and soon I was in the back of a police SUV racing across the misty moors at 90 miles per hour. It was a police escort, lights flashing, oncoming traffic steered to the shoulder, the whole 9 yards. My parents were already dead, and as bad as it sounds, all I could think was, what's the rush? I understood it was important to find their killers as soon as possible. But while their bodies were found last week, they'd likely been dead since I moved out 6 whole years ago. The sun was setting when we rolled into the village, and the SUV I was in pulled into the villages, only in while the rest kept driving. We've already got your room. The officer held a key between his fingers, and I took it. It's room 14. The police station is too small for the crowd we're having tomorrow. We're leading the investigation out of the community hall on High Street. We're getting started at 9 o'clock. What are we doing there? We're going over everything we know, starting from scratch. We can pick you up, or, he nodded his head down the road, you can walk. It's 5 minutes from here. I remember. Thanks, and don't worry, no press is allowed in. If anyone bugs you, or if there's anything you need, you just call Ross. Thanks, Oliver, I'm sorry about all this. Yeah. Again, thanks. I grabbed my small duffel and went to my room. Inside, I looked around briefly. The inn was cleaner than what I'd pictured the countless times I'd driven by it growing up. The room was cold, and the heavy tartan curtains were drawn. I kept them closed and lay on the bed in the dark. Here I was, home again. I thought about going to the off-license and getting drunk so I could sleep, but thought better of it. I didn't want to deal with the details of my dead family while hungover. Instead, I stared at the wooden beams on the ceiling and thought about Alois. That was a bad idea. I rose in an existential panic a few minutes later and paced the room. I couldn't be alone. I unlocked my phone. I still had a few friends in the village and called my closest one, Finley. He picked up on the first ring. Oliver? Hey, Finley. I've been thinking of calling, really. I'm sorry, I thought you had enough on your mind, man. I'm the one who left and never called. I'm the one who should feel guilty. Well, what's up? I just got into town. I heard you were coming. You trying to go on a night walk? Finley and I had this thing in secondary school where, when there was nothing to do, often as that was, we'd roam the village and coastal paths, talking and drinking for miles. Dude, Finley spoke as if dumbfounded by coincidence. I literally just left the off-license. I met him outside my in-room not 20 minutes later, and he awkwardly hugged me with a six-pack in one hand. Man, Finley placed one of his massive palms on my shoulder and leaned back. Did you get shorter? No, you somehow got even taller, you circus freak. See, I didn't move away. I kept eating haggis and drinking whiskey. Do they even have proper food in London? Or are you some kind of quinoa freak now? What's it like being so short and pretentious? Boy, is it nice, he smiled. No girl has ever expected me to find the clitoris, and oh boy do I get praised like a dog when I do. You're telling me the village girls finally developed a fetish for old Frankenstein. Once you left, I was the prime entree, my friend. He playfully tapped my leg with the six-pack. So where are we walking to? You're not going to like it. His happy expression dropped. You don't want to go there, do you? Yeah, I do. Just to see it, we can't go inside. It's a crime scene anyway. He cracked a beer and started drinking. Okay, he sighed, and looked toward the direction of my old house. I can do that. By the time we were walking on the narrow coastal path, it was already dark. We spent most of the way there talking about mutual acquaintances in the village. The topic of the murders had been avoided until then. After a silence between topics, Finley downed another beer and tossed the bottle into the heather. I stopped and pointed. You're really still doing that? What? Tossing your bottles in the undergrowth? We're not 16 anymore, man. You've got some weird priorities right now. I shook my head and kept walking. It was late summer, and the sounds of the sea crashing against the rocks below gave the air a restless feel that made the silence we shared uneasy. We were almost to the house when Finley cleared his throat. So, you don't have to talk about any of this stuff with me if you don't want to, but, I've been hearing the craziest rumors. Yeah. Do you know what I'm talking about? I nodded at my feet. That's all just bull, right? The things these fishwives can come up with, stranger than fiction. I didn't say anything. My old childhood home had come into view. There were no lights on, and in the dark, its silhouette was outlined sinisterly against the night sky. They're just rumors, right, Oliver? There was fear in his voice, and while I heard him perfectly, I still couldn't bring myself to speak as I watched the house in the distance. Oliver, I looked at him. Those fishwives actually put it all together pretty well. Even in the black night, I could see his face blanch. You're messing with me. I shook my head. Finley yanked a beer from the pack. and twisted off the cap. "I'm so sorry, Oliver." He tilted his head back and drank deeply. "Everyone in the village is." Finley finished his beer with a burp, but this time he put it back into the cardboard six-pack. As soon as he did, he pulled out another, and I couldn't help but smile. "Afraid?" Finley nodded as he put the new bottle to his lips. "I suppose we should be scared. Come on. The gate will be locked, but if we cut through this field, we can get close." I started walking, giving Finley little time to protest. We crossed the heather and stepped over the property line, where grass turned to rocky terrain. The house never had a lawn, at least that I can remember. My parents never tended the grounds, and apart from the gravel drive, most of the property was overgrown with gorse and heather. We got within 30 feet of the house before we stopped in waist-high bracken. Finley reached behind his back and pulled out a flask he'd clipped to his belt. I heard him crack the metal cap, drink, and smelled the whiskey as he passed me the little bottle. I took a long pull. The air glugged back several times before I lowered the flask and sucked air noisily through my teeth to steady my stomach. "Why would you ever want to come back here?" I ignored his question. "This whiskey reminds me of how the water here always tasted like brine. All this grandeur, and it couldn't beat the tap water from a council flat." Finley said nothing. "Do you remember when this place flooded?" I continued. "I would have been your age when that happened. I heard about it." I could see where the slate-colored stone was stained with salt from when the sea had risen through the foundations. It flooded the week we moved in, just a few days after. Apparently, the entire interior had to be rebuilt. I was 2 or 3. I don't remember a thing. But my family never treated me the same afterward. Growing up, I thought the flood was somehow my fault. Even if I did leave a window open to the storm, who blames a baby, or holds a grudge at least? But my parents, I frowned. Well, they seemed like the kind of people who would do that, didn't they? Can I just say it? I felt I read his thoughts and smiled. Sure, he exhaled in relief. "I know you weren't close, but God, those folks gave me the creeps. I met them twice and couldn't sleep both nights." I shrugged. "No hard feelings, your sisters too. I'm glad they weren't in our form." "Yeah, were you close with your sisters?" "No, not really. But they were normal to me." Finley nodded and took another swig. He wiped his mouth with his hand and patted my back. "Oliver, yeah, can we get out of here?" "Yeah." I laughed, but just then our attention was taken to the path where gravel crunched under something heavy. It took a second to make it out in the dark, but an enormous vehicle crept towards us. Suddenly, we were blinded, and we squinted through our fingers toward the dark. "Hey!" Oh, damn! Finley was already pounding away through the bracken. "Cops!" I stood still. "Finley, get back here." "That's our ride." I saw the outline of the officer get out of the car. "Did you hear me? You there, you're trespassing. I thought we made it clear to all you kids that this place was under 24-hour watch, and that any more trespassers will be prosecuted." "No buts, sorry, I haven't been here in a while. Did you hear me?" "No buts." Inspector said to prosecute the next teens dumb enough to mess around this place, to send a message. "That can be us, kid." "I don't want to book you. You a Rangers fan?" "No." "Well, it's the 11th inning, and I ain't missing a pitch now. Your friend there has got the right idea. You go on now and run before the police." I started walking closer. I was thinking maybe a ride for old time's sake, huh? He squinted and stepped further from the car. Oh, Oliver. How you doing, Oliver? He said in disbelief and looked at the house. What are you doing here, remembering? Ah. For what it's worth, he raised his arms and let them smack to his sides. I'm sorry. He looked me over as if he were looking for something he hadn't seen when I used to live there. I'm so sorry. Yeah, don't worry about it. You can't bring people back from the dead anyway. He shook his head to clear it. Ah, so that must have been the big guy. He pointed into the bracken. I thought I saw a glimpse of a Sasquatch when I hit those brights. Yeah, Finley, get out here. We were both silent as we listened to the bracken rustle. There was a distant shout. Are you sure? Yeah, I'm sure. Do you want to walk back to town? I turned to the officer. You don't mind giving me a ride back to the inn? No, of course not. Anything, thanks. Come on, Finley. We watched Finley stand and tower over the bracken. In just a few steps, it seemed like he covered 100 feet and stood next to us. Hey, Officer Campbell, I should have known. Was it his idea to come out here? He pointed at Finley. God, no. Finley wasn't paying us any attention as he brushed dirt off his metal flask. This scaredy cat. I walked closer to the squad car. Can we drink in the car? Finley wiggled the whiskey flask. Finley, you don't even fit in my cruiser. We've been over this. I'm taking Oliver, but you can walk. I told you, that's just if you're stuffing more than one guy in the back. Oliver can ride shotgun, then I'll fit. The cop waved dismissively and got into the driver's seat. When we started up the drive, there was still the comfortable sound of football on the radio, with the strong Scottish voice of the announcer, and the soft cheering and chattering of thousands of fans behind him. It was hard to feel any fear. I pictured the stadium, the millions of midges whirling under the lights, the tired kids leaning against their nervous fathers with fingers sticky from candy floss, ready to go to bed. I managed to forget where I was and smiled. So, Officer Campbell turned off the radio and broke the silence. Oliver, I've been hearing all sorts of rumors running around. I leaned my head into my hand and closed my eyes. He picked at his collar. That's all just bull, right? When I woke in the morning, I considered it a good thing that I was still drunk and not hungover. Finley and I had gotten dropped off at the off-license and walked back to my inn. I don't remember much of the night, but at some point, Finley had left because the other bed was empty. One of the deputies had given me a wake-up call at 8, and I showered, drank a couple of warm beers to keep the buzz going, and dressed. I walked to the community hall. Some press was set up with their satellite trucks in front of the building. Inspector Ross had been on the lookout for me when I was getting close, worrying I'd be recognized. He led me around the block and through the back. I was ushered into a medium-sized meeting room with 3 long tables forming a horseshoe, and they sat me at the center. At the end of the room on a cart was a big black television where our reflections fish-eyed in the dark glass. Every seat in the room was already full, and based on the empty paper cups of coffee that many officials had in front of them, it looked like this conference had started an hour or more earlier. A woman in a suit stood as I sat. She wore her hair up, and I glanced at the pistol bulging on her hip. Mr. MacDougall, please, I said quickly. Oliver is fine. Of course I'm sorry, she smiled at me pityingly. Oliver, thanks for coming. We can't imagine what this must be like. And before we get started, I want to make clear that we can stop whenever you like. If you need to take a break, that's fine. Okay, my name is Detective Eiley Grant, and I'm the lead investigator on this case with the Highlands Constabulary. You're going to be hearing from a lot of people today. She turned to the table to her right and pointed. We have Dr. Lamont, the Duncraig coroner. He lifted his hand from the table in a weak wave. Angus Fraser, our fire and rescue chief until 2012. And Doctors Heather Craig and Ian Wallace are here from the University of Edinburgh, where they specialize in forensic pathology. I understand you must have a lot of questions, and of course, we have a lot for you. I think it's best we get this over with right away, so we can get started in earnest. If you want to adjourn for a while, that will be totally fine. She looked into my eyes, and I was glad to finally return a gaze. I'm so sorry, Oliver. Your DNA results came back last night with a 99.9% chance for both paternity and maternity. The room was silent while they stared at me. I inhaled audibly and sighed for a long time. I figured as much, right? We've been told that you talked on the phone before coming here with Inspector Ross about the circumstances surrounding the bodies. I remembered the call, but not the details. I'd gotten so drunk during it that the only thing that remained in my memory was some hint of a horrible thesis. I was drunk then in that stuffy community hall and feeling like a child. Enough already. I didn't want to seem any more ignorant. I leaned forward as if to speak into a microphone, even though there was none. That is correct. It felt like the entire room exhaled. People nodded, and Detective Grant smiled. Okay, we're going to take everything back a bit now. Can we start with where you moved from? We're pulling records, but it's bureaucratic and going to take some time. My family had moved here from Dorset, a small coastal town there, Lulworth Cove. Yeah, and do you remember who told you that? No. Do you remember living there? I would have been 2 or something. No, maybe we should start at your first memory. Do you have any idea what that may be, Oliver? I squinted, remembering the feeling of water on my face. I do. I saw our cellar flooded in the night. I remember the storm. Are you referring to when your home flooded in 2001? Yes, that's great. That's a really great place to start. Angus here was the fire and rescue chief then, and one of the first on the scene. Detective Grant gestured to Fraser, but he stayed sitting. When she kept her arm extended, he realized he was being called on and stood. Hi, Oliver. He turned on the television and hit some buttons, and static filled the screen. Some of you may remember Robbie Johnston. He was a teenager at the time of the flood, and perhaps an amateur filmmaker. He liked to follow the department around and film disasters. Luckily, he made it out there when the MacDougall home flooded. I've got the tape here. He hit play, and there we were. It was beautifully shot. My parents stood with their backs to the camera, and my little sisters were standing at their feet. All of them stood stoically still, as they watched the home being engulfed by seawater in the night. They held a toddler in their arms, me, I realized, and smiled. Now this video is just 7 minutes of this. See, there's no pumps available out there, and the tide was already so progressed that there wasn't much to do anyway but let it recede. But, I frowned as the fire chief stuttered, and his voice began to get nasally with tears. I, I, I found you that night, Oliver, just after we pulled up. I found you wandering around the outskirts of the property, all by yourself. Of course, your folks had just moved in that week. No one had ever met them. I didn't know what they looked like. He pinched his nose and squinted. I was carrying you around, thinking your folks were dead in the cellar, when suddenly I saw those people staring at the waves. I swear they hadn't been there before, but it was dark and a little hectic. They must have been waiting under those hawthorns. I brought you over to them. He paused, trying to compose himself, and sobbed. I put you in their arms. I was angry at his guilt. I should be the one crying. I should be the one who gets to break down. Detective Grant saw my scowl and patted the fire chief's shoulder. She gestured to his chair, and he sat. I'm sorry, Oliver. The chief got a little ahead of what you know. Based on the salt residue found on the bodies and the carbon dating, we believe that the night of the flood was likely the first contact you and anyone in this village made with the suspects. Suspects, I thought and frowned. Oliver, are you with us? I'm not sure, the room quietly wheezed. Everyone looked at one another and shifted in their folding chairs. Oliver, I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to know you're following this 100%. I believe you said Inspector Ross explained the situation when he called. I don't remember. Detective Grant hesitated, but then spoke firmly. The bodies found in the home that the DNA identified, as your biological parents have been there for more than 2 decades. The lead suspects in the case are the people that raised you. We believe they may be responsible for the murder of your birth mother and father. Where were they found? I heard myself suddenly say. Your biological parents. Yes, somehow the others in the room grew even more uncomfortable. Your parents were found in the cellar, in the salt grotto specifically. In the salt grotto, I paused. It's used for storage. The fire chief covered his mouth, and we all watched him speedwalk from the room before Detective Grant continued. No, it's the main source of salt preservation for the manor. Ah, I said. I want to emphasize that the salt was very potent year-round. The bodies were surprisingly well preserved and never entered into advanced decomposition. I couldn't speak anymore. I stared in shocked horror at the TV screen. The video was still playing, and I watched as the woman's hair fluttered in the wind. She held me in her arms as the waves flickered beautifully in front of her. So, who were these people that didn't mind the taste of salt in the milk? Who waited in the hawthorns for my family to go to sleep before murdering them in the night, only to vanish after raising me for 16 years. Oliver, in that moment, I felt nothing but a terrible clarity that whoever they were, I was going to stop at nothing until I found out. But the answers I found were so insidious. I only wish now I'd run from the room. Oliver, we need to know you're following everything. Would you like a break? No. I pictured my parents immersed in salt and bit my tongue to keep from crying. I understand. You finally found my family. When I stepped out of the community hall into the alley around noon, it was sweltering. We had never adjourned. I'd spent the last 3 hours giving every shred of information I could about the people that raised me. I don't know what to call them. Thing 1 and Thing 2. Mom and Dad. Whoever they were, after scouring my memory, I was certain they never said anything about grandparents or other family elsewhere in the country. They never suggested moving, and we'd never even gone on holiday. I had no leads on where they might have vanished to. Detective Grant said they were still searching the house for any DNA, and were asking around the village for 6-year-old surveillance footage to hopefully get some pictures. But that was it. There was little to go off. It seemed incredible that these people could raise me for as long as they did and leave so little evidence of who they were. They had gone by my parents' names, Duncan and Isla, and used my parents' national insurance numbers and bank accounts. They had taken their lives and, in the process, scrubbed any evidence of who they actually were. The police had confirmed my biological parents were real. They had shown me photos of them and had their birth certificates and driving license records from Dorset. But I didn't want to know about them. I didn't want to know about the normal life and loving parents I was supposed to have. When I was excused from the room, the police told me they were going to let the media know about the age of the bodies and the DNA results. Standing in the alley, I heard the roar of reporters from the other side of the building as the news broke. I was asked to come back to the community hall for more questioning at 2 o'clock. In the meantime, I was heading back to my in-room for a liquid lunch when I got to the mouth of the alley. A woman was standing alone on the pavement, staring at me. She wasn't all that old, but her face was heavily wrinkled and her hair frayed wildly. Oliver MacDougall. She took a timid step toward me. She didn't look like she was with the news, but I figured her as some amateur true crime chaser. I'm not a reporter. You must be Oliver. You have the same eyes as that baby. Oliver, I'm your aunt. I'm your biological mother's sister. I'm sorry, but I'm a little skeptical about familial relations these days. If you think I'm your nephew, you can give a DNA sample to the police. I can do that, of course, but please just look. She pulled a picture from her pocket and held it out to me. It was creased, with a cross from being folded into a square. I squinted. In the picture was a baby held by a much younger version of the woman I saw before me. But sure enough, smiling next to us were the faces of my biological parents. As relieved as I was for a lead, I was mourning the delay of my liquor. I took her into the community hall with me, and the 2 o'clock meeting was moved to that second. My aunt's name was Margaret. She said after my parents had moved from Dorset, she never heard from them again. She was sitting to my right as she told the story. Duncan and Isla were busy people, so not hearing from them didn't set off any alarm bells at first. But after about 6 months, Isla still wasn't returning my calls. I had promised my sister I'd visit anyway, so I bought a train ticket. Detective Grant was standing in front of the room and looked at Margaret gravely. And Duncan and Isla, did they say why they moved? Margaret frowned. No, they never said, or maybe I never asked. They had a lot of money from Duncan's father, and I was told his family was from the Highlands. Why exactly they chose to move here, I don't know. I only spoke with Isla a couple times a year. So, what happened when you came to visit? Well, I got a rental car and drove all the way to their new address. Their car was in the driveway, which I remember gave me some relief. But when I knocked on the door, the man that answered wasn't Duncan. I said I'm looking for the MacDougall family, and he said, speaking. I said, you're not Duncan MacDougall, and he just smiled. He didn't say anything else. He just kept this big, creepy smile on his face. And he slammed the door. Did you notify the police? Of course. I sped into the village and pounded on that police station door. I told them everything I just told you. They looked at me like I was crazy. A cop followed me out there and spoke to that man, but said I needed some evidence for my accusations. They asked me if I could provide documents or the driving licenses of the MacDougals. I said not that minute, but I could eventually. I flew home to gather everything I could. I mailed it to the police station here, but that was the last I heard of it. Inspector Ross frowned, leaned back, and glared at Margaret. Do you remember who the officer was? Did you ever call again to follow up? Margaret looked uncomfortable. That man, she pointed to the inspector. It was him. And no. Detective Grant glanced at the inspector for a moment before continuing. Why didn't you contact anyone again? Because there was something wrong with the whole thing. Because, to be honest, it felt like one big conspiracy. Like they knew the MacDougals weren't who they said they were. I had the feeling if I came back here raising hell, that the next person to knock on my door looking for me would be greeted by some smiling creep calling herself Margaret. So that's it. You left it at that. No further inquiries to any law enforcement agency. No, Inspector Ross, Detective Grant had turned to him. Do you remember these events? Ross never took his gaze off Margaret. Inspector, it's lies. Every word this woman's saying. Detective Grant, you're from Glasgow, so maybe you're not familiar with the crime around here, but it's few and far between. If 15 years ago, some lady came here saying the new creepy family wasn't who they said they were, I'd remember. The whole village would. None of this ever happened. Everyone was looking at Margaret. It did, she leaned back and looked fearfully around the room. It did happen. Perhaps it was that nothing could shock me after that morning's news, or that the booze was finally leaving my system. But either way, I was apathetic to Margaret's arrival. I felt like the spectator of a soap opera and excused myself from the room. Before I left, they asked me if I'd stay in the village, while Margaret's DNA results were being processed. I agreed and told them to call if there were any worthy developments, and went back to the inn. The rest of the day, I don't remember much. I drank alone in the inn with the curtains drawn, and to be frank, my clearest thoughts were spent contemplating whether or not to end my life. The next day, when I woke up, I spent the only 10 minutes of sobriety. I had to return one of my girlfriend, Aloyse's, dozens of missed calls. I had to talk her into canceling the flight she'd booked when she hadn't heard from me, but heard the news. I told her I was okay. I told her I'd be back in a day, maybe two. None of it was true. I suppose I was on some kind of suicide watch, since the officer would knock on my door twice a day to ask if I needed anything. I hated being watched over. Their ever-present concern made me feel like a child. The second night there, I turned off my phone, slipped out of my room, and went to crash on Finley's couch. I must have drunk the shock out of my system, because the next morning, I woke up without the urge to grab a beer from the fridge. The burning curiosity I had felt in the community hall was back. I couldn't just drink the rest of my life away, because I had a great excuse to do so. When Finley woke and came downstairs, I was sitting at his kitchen table. It took half an hour of convincing, and for Finley to drink about 6 breakfast beers in that time. But that night, he was coming with me to my old house. I wanted to see it. I wanted to see the salt grotto. Finley's eyes were glassy as he stared into space. Why can't the police take you? I'm sure they'd show you around the scene, because what fun is that? Okay. Are you sure it has to be tonight? We could always put it off for a day and hang out. It's got to be tonight, I smiled. Celtic play Rangers at 7. We waited for it to get dark before we took Finley's car to a coastal path just 2 miles from the house. We parked and set out across the moors. There were no stars, and in the country dark, we didn't even bother crouching when cars passed. It was quieter that night, no waves, just the sound of heather rustling against our legs, and Finley's flask glugging in his backpack. Did you need to bring half a gallon of liquor? Hey man, did you want to go alone? We stopped as he tossed his backpack around and pulled out the flask. I stood with my hands on my hips as he sipped. As I looked into the distance, my hair stood on end and tears welled in my eyes. A 1/4 mile away, where a stone wall met the field, a figure stood staring at us. I could just make out their shadow against the rocks. There's someone watching us. Finley choked on the whiskey and started coughing. Not funny, not joking. He put an enormous hand on my shoulder and stood behind me as if I were a shield. Where? I pointed, and he followed my finger as I stuck my arm out. The figure turned and stepped calmly behind the wall. What the? I turned and kept walking. Oliver, we got to get out of here. It's probably just a reporter. You don't believe that. You're right, I don't. But okay. I nodded my head the way we had come. You're free to walk back to the car alone. He held the giant flask in both hands and drank. Screw this. Screw you. It was easy to get into the house. Officer Campbell's car was parked far up the driveway toward the road, and we slipped through the glassless window on the first floor. Inside was pitch black, but to avoid being spotted, we couldn't use torches until we were in the cellar. I reached out to find the wall and pictured the way to the cellar door. Okay, I know the way downstairs. Stay right behind me. I got to the cellar door quickly and turned on my torch at the entrance. The damp stairs creaked, and we could hear each other's hearts as we crept down into the dark. Thankfully, the cellar was one giant unfinished hole in the ground, meaning there wasn't a labyrinth of rooms like the floors above. There was little space for anything to hide and pop out at us. In the center of the crumbling stone floor lay the entrance to the salt grotto. It was open, and the giant metal lid lay upside down next to it. When I saw the lid, I blanched. I suddenly remembered I had tried to lift it as a child, just to see if I could. Of course, it was too heavy. I felt like crying as I pictured myself as a little boy, heaving with all my might on the handle, too little to lift it, too little to reveal the truth. I heard liquor sucked from the flask behind me and shook my head as I walked to the mouth of the open hole. It had been drained, and a long aluminum ladder descended into its depth. The light of the torch seemed to barely touch the bottom, but I could see that the grotto was a cylinder lined with salt-encrusted stone. I'm going in there, I said, turning to Finley. What? He fumbled, putting the flask back in his bag. You got a scuba suit. It's drained. I can't let you. As your friend Oliver, he started stumbling, has some sense. You'll drown. It's empty, Finley. There's no water. I'll save you. I turned back to the hole. I heard him stumble toward me. and then came a thundering thump from the floor. I flinched and threw myself around. I shone the light on Finley. A cloud of dust was still scrambling up from where he'd fallen. Lying flat and face down on the floor, the length of his body was comically long. "Are you okay, buddy?" Finley, before I stepped toward him, I heard a soft snore. "Okay, that's probably for the best." I put my torch in my teeth and started down the ladder. It was an unstable descent, and I kept my eyes on my hands. At the bottom, my trainers sucked in the salt-encrusted mud. I shone the light around and froze. There were words scribbled into the stone wall. Symbols, thousands of them. I slowly brought the light up the wall, and my eyelids reeled in fear. Scrawled across the stone, with its Triskel points stretching several feet, was a Celtic knot. This was not discussed in the meeting. I walked to the wall, a slurp of mud echoing up the cylinder. The salt had worn the stone, but by reading slowly and tracing my finger in the carvings, I could make sense of it. "Our son Oliver, a star fell the night you were born, as beautiful as our baby boy. You can't imagine our delight when we were told that star was your soul. We believe we were told the truth. We believe we were giving you the world. Oliver, we only wish to serve by your side, your eternal servants, Mum and Dad. We love you." I stepped back from the wall with my mouth agape. Mum and Dad. Did my real parents write this? I looked around frantically. Every word carved into the grotto was the same message repeated over and over again. The words stretched up its entire length. It must have taken weeks. I stumbled backward to the ladder and climbed it in a panic. "Finley, Finley, wake up." He lifted his face off the floor and squinted. I turned my phone on for the first time in a day. I had messages from the inspector from Alois, but then I frowned. The coroner had texted me, urging me to call. "Finley, we have to go upstairs. Oh God, are we still in the spooky house? Not for long." I went over and helped him up. He reached for his backpack, but I yanked out the flask and hurled it to the wall where it shattered. He paused for a second and mocked. "Hey man, we're not 16 anymore. Come on." I stumbled back up the stairs with Finley's immense weight halfway on my shoulders. Back on the first floor, I shrugged him to the ground and called the coroner. It was late, and I'd hoped he'd kept his ringer on. He answered on what would have been one of the last rings. "Oliver, hey, I know everyone's been calling me. I'm fine, I just needed a break from it all." "Yeah, we figured as much. But have you? You heard my report?" "No." "I saw your text." "Right." I heard him sigh as he rose from bed. "Oliver, I know this may sound even stranger, and trust me, I doubled and triple-checked everything. I came to this conclusion a few days ago, and I really took my time to make sure." "What, Dr. Lamont? Your biological parents' wounds are self-inflicted. There were no defense markings. The cuts down their arms were sure and steady. But those bodies are so old. Salt preservation is a coroner's best friend. I'm sure about this." And there was a note of sorts at the scene. "You mean the Celtic stuff they told you?" "Yeah, something like that." He didn't respond, and I brought the phone down from my ear. "I've got to go." I hung up and stared into the dark. I listened to my ears ring, but suddenly I flung my face to the ceiling. There were footsteps coming from the floor above, slow and searching, creaking down the length of the hall. "Oliver, SHH. I craned my neck to look down the hall and out the front window. I saw the taillights of the police cruiser as it turned onto the road and drove away. The footsteps continued, and my eyes widened as I realized where they were headed. They were headed toward the stairs. The footsteps were descending now. I could hear the stair treads crack and pop as they were met with weight. Finley stood mumbling. "I'm out of here," he said, and threw himself out the first-floor window, where his limp body whacked into the gorse. I stayed inside. I walked as calm as I could into the foyer, where that grand staircase accordioned into darkness. She was waiting for me at the foot of the stairs. It was Margaret. "You've read your parents' note." She smiled and wiped away what must have been tears of joy. "Isn't it beautiful?" I shivered and said nothing. "You want to know if it's true, don't you?" "I don't care. You're just another one of those creeps." "But you do, Oliver." How could any person with a hint of curiosity in their bones not want to know? We were both silent for a moment before she spoke. "I know where they are, the creatures that raised me. They're just people, Oliver. You're people. All of us are. You are the one with the chance to become something more. Well, unlucky for you, I never want to see those people again. They very much want to see you." She stepped forward and extended a small leather notebook. "This will tell you how to get there." She wiggled it, and finally I snatched it out of her hand. "Good, Oliver. Go get some rest. It's half a day's drive." She started walking to the front door, and I shouted after her. "Hey, wait," she stopped. "So all that stuff you said in the meeting about coming back here and filing police reports, it was all a lie. You have to excuse the villagers. You see, they're all very excited for your return." And with that, she left. I stood there for a minute and leafed through the leather notebook. The directions stopped at the entrance of an old coastal road in the forests of western Sutherland, the land of lochs and mountains, and now, at least in my mind, Celtic cults. Fun. I stuffed the book into my pocket and went back to the window Finley had dove from. He wasn't lying in the gorse below. "Finley," I called out to the fields and stayed silent for a response. When none came, I dropped down. I thought Finley had previously tried to make a break for the car, but got lost in the dark. I called his name as I walked and listened for the sound of snores, but all I could hear were waves. He had the keys anyway, and I was sure he would wake up in the morning after having bedded down for the night somewhere in the heather. I walked back to the village, and the moment my face hit the cold sheets of my bed, I slept. As soon as I woke, I threw everything I had left in the inn room together and walked to Finley's. His car was outside, which surprised me, and I frowned as I knocked on the door. There was no response, but it was unlocked. I went inside. The house was a little more than 1,000 square feet, and it didn't take long to figure out that he wasn't there. I packed up my things and called a cab from Inverness to pick me up and bring me back there. I was going to rent a car. I was going, against all my better judgment, to Sutherland. The cab would take more than an hour to arrive, and I sat waiting on Finley's porch both for the cab and for any sign of him. I had been nodding off with my head on the porch beam when I heard brakes squeak as a car stopped. It was the inspector. "Hey, Oliver, hey." I stood and looked both ways down the block. A few curtains flashed in the neighbors' houses. How long had they been watching me? "I know you were at your old place last night." Who told you that? Well, the coroner says you called him. He says you knew about the writings your folks left. Not a lot of people know that. Maybe someone told me. Maybe I wasn't there. Well, I went by there this morning and found a big old flask of whiskey smashed in the cellar. That wasn't there the last time I was. I stopped at the off-license and asked that clerk, Mora, if she'd sold any flasks of Talisker recently. And that's not to mention all that grotto mud still caked on your trainers. He pointed at my feet. You boys aren't as smooth as you think. I crossed my arms. Why didn't you tell me about the writings? Oliver, isn't it obvious? He took a step toward me. Let's not play this game. When I met you at the airport, you were drunk. When you came to the meeting, you were drunk. Every time you opened that in-room door, do you think the deputy couldn't see the bottles behind you? We're worried about you, lad. In this case, your situation. You want my honest take? I said nothing. It's insane. One bite at a time. That's how we're going to break it to you. What's the point of telling you about that Celtic nonsense if we didn't even know who wrote it? I felt doubt subdue my paranoia. I'm sorry, but Officer Campbell. What about him? When I was in the house last night, he left as if he wanted me to find the truth. Oh, come on, it's Campbell. He was probably going to get more cigarettes. Oliver, we're here to serve you. My head snapped up, and I took a step back. What? We're here for you. To serve me, huh, Oliver? It says it on the squad car. He pointed to the cursive protect and serve decal. Just then, he saw my cab turn onto the block, and I hurried past him to meet it. The cab came to a stop, and the trunk latch popped. The inspector never asked me where I was going, and I didn't plan to tell him. I threw my duffel in the trunk and opened the back door. You'll understand, Oliver. I paused and looked at the inspector over my shoulder, and he smiled. My promise, son. This will all be okay. I got to Inverness just after noon and wasted no time getting a rental. By 1 o'clock, I was driving north across the length of the Highlands. My phone said I'd arrive at a lock, the closest landmark to the entrance of the coastal road mentioned in the directions, just after 11 o'clock at night. I was an hour away from reaching Ullapool when I realized someone was following me. A black Land Rover had been in my rear view for far too long, and I stopped to top off my tank even though I hardly needed it. The Rover sped past when I pulled into the petrol station, but I couldn't get a good look at the driver. When I got back on the empty highway, there was no sign of the Land Rover. But after 20 more minutes on the road, I saw it in my rear view, only further away this time, trying to be more hidden. It must have been wading down a country road for me to pass. I was going to confront whoever it was, but as I began to slow, I saw another car start to overtake the Land Rover in the opposite lane. It was almost too far away for me to understand what I saw. The car swerved violently into the Land Rover, sending it spinning into the ditch, and disappeared into the mist. I slammed on my brakes and turned the rental around. By the time I got to where the collision had happened, the other car was long gone. I saw nothing but a slight shimmer of sun on its glass as it raced away. There were no other cars around, and I left mine running in the road while I got out and walked to the wreckage. The heather was combed to the earth where the Land Rover had rolled over it, and 40 feet from the ditch, the car sat upside down, one of its wheels still spinning as smoke rose from the engine. I crept cautiously toward the cab. It was a newer Range Rover Sport with all the safety features, but the metal was twisted horribly where it had rolled several times. I bent down while still several feet away. The thick scent of leaking diesel deterred me from getting any closer. I froze. Inside the cab was the contorted corpse of the inspector. His dead eyes stared back at me. I stood and looked around. Wind whistled in the heather and played with the smoke. There was no one else around. It would take a half hour for first responders to even get there. And then what? Even though I knew the car that took him off the road was gone, I still felt like I was being watched. I walked back to my car and got in. Was the inspector trying to help me? And who ran him off the road? Margaret. After all, I thought as I started the car, who else could it be? I didn't stop for nearly 200 miles. I was a little more than an hour away when I had to get petrol again. And by then, it was nearly dark. While standing at the pump, I looked at the rich shadow of the mountains poking up from a desolate moor in the distance. Somewhere in there were the people who drowned my parents. My soul was Morrigan's. As I hung the nozzle, I noticed a car had pulled to the shoulder about a quarter mile down the A road. I had been watching my rearview mirror closely after witnessing the accident, and there were a couple of times that I thought I was being followed again. But it didn't matter much. If it was Margaret, she knew where I was headed anyway. Soon I was ascending the mountains, weaving through dark roads lined with ancient pines. My heart beat steadily, rising along with the slight altitude. Why had I agreed to come here? For all I knew, I was the last piece of their puzzle to sacrifice. I passed the black shadow of the lock and jumped as my GPS said I had arrived. I kept my eyes peeled for the coastal road. The little leather book said it was the first right after the lock, and far too soon I was there. I rolled to a stop and sat in the car in the dark. I thought about turning around, but the moment I did, toward the end of the road, I saw the soft orange glow of fire. The road proved to be too rugged for my rental, and I pulled to the side and continued on foot. The lights were further ahead than they first appeared, but after a few hundred feet, I could see what they illuminated. 5 nooses hung from the branch of an oak tree. The torches that lit the scene were not tiny, but crudely made of iron. As I got closer, I couldn't see anyone. There were just nooses, gently swinging in the sea wind. "Hello," I called, and 2 young women in white dresses stepped from behind the oak tree. My stepsisters of a sort. They didn't look at me immediately. They took turns holding each other's hands as they stepped onto a stone that acted as a stool. Then they fixed 2 of the nooses around their necks. "What are you doing?" I spoke, but it came out as a horrified whisper. "Welcome home, Oliver," they said in tandem, and jumped off the short stone. The fall wasn't far enough to break their necks. At the height they'd hopped from, they would just slowly suffocate. I started running to them. "What are you doing?" No, I raced to them, stumbling toward the tree. But when I got close, I saw their white dresses were both blotched red. I stared at them in horror as I watched blood trickle from their toes in thick streams. There were razors in the ropes. They were both smiling at me, their mouths black with blood, the life quickly leaving their eyes. "No," I whispered. "Oliver," the voice came from my left, but I didn't need to know who it was. "You," I turned, and there they were. The people that raised me. The people that tricked my parents into killing themselves. You demented freaks. Anger is natural now. The man stepped forward. He was little changed from the last time I saw him. He had the same high forehead and soulless eyes, only with a little more wrinkles. "We're here to give you everything," the woman chimed in and smiled. "We're here to give you the world. Do tell, please." The man gestured at my feet. "Don't stand there." I looked down. I was standing in a shallow stone trough, beneath the nooses that was quickly filling with blood. I took 2 full steps backward into the grass. "Margaret told us you read the note your parents left you." He pointed into the dark, and I realized at the edge of the firelight stood Margaret. I immediately looked down the road I had come in from and frowned. The thing I once thought was my mother began to speak. "You are a very special boy, Oliver. On the night you were born, the starlit Morrigan fell. Did you know it falls just once in a human lifetime?" She looked at me expectantly, as if this information alone would change my entire perspective. "Well, no matter. But that star fell on you. Our Lady had died the very day of your birth, but her soul wasted no time to return to earth. Are you wackos saying I'm Morrigan? No. Not yet. All you have to do is spill the blood of the one you loved, and then we shall baptize you." They were smiling at their daughters proudly, and I began to feel sick. I pitied them. I looked at the hanging sisters, their faces already cold and dead, but their smiles just as wide. I did not love those girls, of course not. But the blood from one girl doesn't make for a good baptism. Margaret started stepping forward, and I noticed there was something halfway hidden behind her. My heart leapt. Alois, it was my girlfriend, bound and gagged. Margaret hurled her forward, where she fell on the grass lifelessly. "Don't worry, she's just drugged. It'll make it easier for you." I took a lunging step toward Margaret and raised my fist, but suddenly I felt immensely weak, and I stumbled instead. This brings us to the second part. We had hoped you wouldn't end up so normal. This entire thing is much easier when you welcome her into your heart from the very beginning. But do you feel that? I dropped to my knees. That's your life fading. The second those girls' blood entered the baptism bowl, she could feel how close she is to entering this world again. And now there's no turning back. You can kill the woman you love and be given power and life so great and so eternal. Your sorrow will be forgotten in an instant. If you don't, your life will simply drain until you're dead. I groaned and fell on my side. A pulsing pain was running out of each of my ribs. I know what you're thinking. You think there's no way you would kill this girl you love. No way you'd let this evil enter this earth. But the choice is only an illusion. It is not just death you face, but eternity. I frowned and looked into the man's eyes. If you deny her life, she will take you with her into the void for time ad infinitum. You will wander alone in the darkness. You will know madness previously unknown to man. Do you think there's a difference between 1 and 10 billion years of blackness? You'd have to let us know. I turned away from him. Could this all be true? I tried to think if I could have been poisoned. I hadn't eaten all day. I bought a single bottle of water from a petrol station and drank the whole thing just after opening it. And the way I felt, it was unholy. "You will kill the girl," the man said with certainty. "We will help you raise her into her noose, then we will don our own." You see, he stepped toward me. You would be the first fool to choose eternity. Did they know? I winced in pain. Did the village know? They were promised a great reward for keeping you safe. Everyone knew, Oliver. Everyone, even the children, were told in song. And they shall all be yours, servants. Suddenly, we both frowned as an engine roared in the near distance. I rolled so I could see the road. Coming out of the dark was the black shadow of a car with its lights off. It was violently pitching over the ruts, and in just a few seconds, it was only 50 feet from us. I had never seen the people I had previously known, as my parents, express such emotion. There were many things I could never picture them doing, and running was at the top of the list. They stood motionless like deer in the headlights as the car barreled into them. Their bodies slammed onto the hood before slipping and bouncing as they were hit again by the tires. Margaret, my girlfriend, and I had only been missed by a few feet. The car slid to a stop, and the door flung open, and to my disbelief, I saw all 6'7" of Finley pounding across the grass and ducking under pine branches toward us. Margaret stepped in front of him, but before she could say a word in one fluid motion, Finley drew his arm back as far as he could, formed a fist, and hurled it into her head. Finley had always been a gentle giant, and I was always morbidly curious as to what kind of damage those enormous fists could do. There was a crack like a branch breaking, and Margaret slapped to the earth, motionless. Finley paused and put his hands in the air, and stared at the girls drenched in blood, dangling from their nooses. I had already moved to undo Aloysius' bindings. Once they were off, I positioned her so she lay on her side. Her breathing was slight but steady. I looked up at Finley with uncertainty. "I'm sorry," he ran his hands over his face. "I'm sorry I never told you, and I'm sorry they threatened me, Oliver. I said we'd all be rich when you came back." He settled himself and breathed for a moment. "I knew you weren't Morrigan, but more importantly, I knew there was no way you'd ever want to be one if it were offered. Inspector Ross." He put his hands on his knees and breathed. "I watched you and him at my house. He was getting impatient. He was going to make sure you followed through here tonight. That was you." Despite the strangeness, I managed to smile. "You pit maneuvered the inspector. Did you see that? I obliterated him." It hurt to keep smiling, and I looked down at Aloysius. "Aloysius, are you there?" I said. "We have to get her to a hospital." I looked at the man and woman. They were lifeless in the grass. "Oliver," Finley's tone brought me back to earth. I followed his gaze. He was staring at the trough, where the stones were now glowing. A scarlet light seeped from the earth, some evil beneath growing more restless. "Tell me none of it is true," I said breathlessly, but Finley didn't say anything. "Tell me they're all just a crazy cult, Finley." He looked at me helplessly, and I closed my eyes to keep from crying. Even as I said it, I knew. I could feel it, and then I saw it. Eternity. My mind's eye started playing a picture as clear as a movie. Wandering the darkness, forever, with the goddess I had forsaken from entering this world. But I realized with horror I could still hang Aloysius. After all, I'd been neglected of love my entire life, lied to and tricked. I barely had an ounce of happiness in my life, and now I didn't just face death, but unending suffering. I saw my life as Morrigan stretched out in front of me. I would be powerful. I would be alive. And whoever that thing was that would occupy my body would commit evil the likes of which the world has never seen. But it was all just a fleeting thought. I loved Alois, and as cold to me as it was, I still loved the world. It was the ones who worshipped this thing that made my life so horrible in the first place. Finley, I said, and he looked at me. Don't regret keeping this from me. Don't beat yourself up. You made the right decision in the end, and that's what matters, isn't it? He nodded. Yeah, he started tearing up. You're the best friend I ever had, man. It's okay. I spoke quietly and lay next to Alois. I guess I'm going to be the first fool, because in Alois's pupils, I saw the black pit of eternity, and I knew into it I must walk. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. But if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. I want to share something that happened to me during Thanksgiving weekend in Boston, and it taught me an important lesson. Never accept things from strangers. What I experienced reminded me a lot of that movie, Drag Me to Hell. If you've seen it, you'll remember how the character tries to pass a cursed object to someone else to get rid of a demon. My story took place in Dorchester, while my family was gathered for the holiday. I was tasked with picking up some last-minute groceries we needed. It was almost midnight, and I headed to the only store I knew would still be open. When I arrived, there was someone being helped at the counter, and while I waited my turn, I noticed a man approaching from across the parking lot. He was an elderly gentleman, maybe in his 70s, with a peculiar appearance. He wore all black leather jacket and pants covered in metal studs, along with military-style boots. As soon as he spotted me, he started talking as if we were old friends. "How's it going? I can tell you're into this stuff." I was confused, but responded with an awkward smile, trying to end the conversation. I had no idea what he was talking about, but he persisted. "I want to give you a gift. You're like a student of mine. You appreciate this kind of thing, and you'll love this." He then handed me a CD. It was just the disc itself. No case, no label, no identification whatsoever. I accepted it more out of politeness than genuine interest, thinking maybe it was something he'd recorded himself or from his band. Before walking away, he made a point of saying, "Just don't forget to play this with your family. Make sure everyone listens to it together." He stepped back and disappeared into the darkness. I bought what I needed, and as I headed home, I started feeling strange. It was like something heavy was pressing down on my shoulders. With each step, the sensation grew stronger, as if my body couldn't bear the weight anymore. When I got home, I realized this discomfort had started right after accepting that CD. The old man's words echoed in my mind, and I felt a chill run down my spine. There's a vacant lot next to my house, so without thinking twice, I tossed the CD there. It might sound crazy, but the moment I did that, the awful feeling vanished completely. I went back inside and continued celebrating with my family, trying to ignore what had just happened. The next morning, I woke up with an intense pain in my neck that lasted several days. I didn't think much of it and didn't mention it to anyone. It wasn't until New Year's Eve that I told my girlfriend and her cousin about the incident. They listened carefully and immediately said, That object must have had something bad attached to it, like a curse or something. That's why he insisted so hard that you take it home and play it for everyone. The heaviness you felt must have been connected to it, and the relief when you got rid of it confirms it. After that experience, I can only say one thing: never accept anything from strangers. We never know what intentions lie behind these seemingly harmless offerings. Today, I finally found the courage to share something I've been living with for months now. Ever since it happened, I've been thinking about sharing this story, but I always chicken out at the last moment. I don't know why I feel so ashamed, especially since I've always been someone who never believed in supernatural stories, until I went through something like this myself. I live alone with my daughter Maya. She's 8 years old and is the light of my life, the reason I do everything to keep going. Her father never showed any interest. It's as if he doesn't exist. Though it was difficult at first, with a lot of work and effort, we managed to improve our lives. Now I can even send her to a private school. There's no more valuable investment than her education. I'm certain of that. I know these details might seem off topic, but it's so you can understand our routine, how we live, and especially how it sometimes feels like we're facing the world all alone. I'm sure many mothers will relate. The house we now live in was rented by my Uncle Bob. Before us, it had been occupied for years by an elderly couple named the Hendersons as tenants. When Mrs. Henderson passed away, her son came to pick up Mr. Henderson but left all the furniture behind and never returned. My uncle decided to keep everything that was still in good condition, like the couch and the refrigerator. For me, it was a blessing since I had almost nothing. Plus, Maya's school is just around the corner, so it seemed like the perfect place. Over time, however, I began to sense something strange here. It's hard to describe, a different energy. Sometimes, while we're watching TV in the living room or I'm doing homework with my daughter, we hear what sounds like a woman singing. The sound doesn't come from any neighbor, and we can never identify exactly where it's coming from. Without telling her anything to avoid frightening her, I started walking around the house whenever I heard that voice, trying to discover its source. Once I believed it was coming from the bathroom near the shower. I opened the door, and the sound stopped immediately. The shower curtain was closed, and gathering my courage, I pulled it open, thinking I might find something that would change my life forever. But there was nothing there. No presence, no sound. When I returned to the living room next to my daughter, we heard the voice again, as if it were back in the bathroom. The manifestations began to intensify, becoming impossible to ignore. Even so, I tried to hide them from her, always making up some explanation, even though I didn't believe it myself, just to keep her calm and unafraid to be at home. Anyone who has experienced supernatural things knows how challenging it is for children. The instinct to protect them overcomes any fear we might feel. Our personal safety stops being a priority when faced with the desire to maintain their peace and confidence. My daughter has her own room, her own bed, but since we moved here, she always sleeps with me. It became a habit. Every night I lie down next to her, stroke her hair, and she holds my fingers with her tiny hands as she falls asleep. Despite this closeness, she's quite independent. When she needs to use the bathroom or get water, she goes alone without waking me. She even turns on the light carefully so as not to disturb me. Still, I always notice when she gets up, and when she returns, I embrace her again. One night, as usual, she fell asleep holding my finger. I barely noticed when she left the bed. With half-open eyes, I saw her small silhouette walking toward the kitchen. We always sleep with the door open, so I expected to hear the sound of water being served. But I must have dozed off. Soon after, I felt her return, lying down beside me, snuggling as she always did. I reached out to touch her hair, but something was different. I didn't feel her long, smooth strands. They were short and weathered. That's when I realized the fingers holding my hand weren't hers. They were thin, wrinkled, and stiff. My scream was immediate and desperate. In a reflex, I pushed that thing away and moved to the other side of the bed. My daughter, startled, rushed into the room, turned on the light, and through tears asked what had happened. I couldn't catch my breath to explain or calm her down. I looked around. There was no one else there, just the two of us. But I knew what had happened. It wasn't a dream. It couldn't have been. That same night, I decided we needed to leave. I drove aimlessly until she fell asleep in the car. Later, I sought out my uncle to tell him what happened. As expected, he didn't believe me, but he suggested calling Father Michael from the church to bless the house if it would bring me some peace. Although I don't have much faith in these things, I agreed. Since then, everything seems calmer, but there's something that still bothers me. As I write these words and share my story, I feel an inexplicable weight. At night, I try to cling to the idea that there must be a scientific explanation for this. It's what keeps my mind clear. Even so, I don't know what to believe anymore. I hope my story reaches someone who can understand, someone who has experienced something similar or knows how to solve this definitively. I would love that more than anything. My grandmother lives in one of the oldest neighborhoods in Savannah, Georgia, down in the historic district, where the Spanish moss hangs so thick you can barely see through it. Just a stone's throw from her house, the cobblestone street ends at a small chapel I'd never noticed before. It's so tiny it looks more like an oversized Victorian dollhouse than a house of worship. We don't visit Grandma very often. She usually makes the trip down to Atlanta to see us. But recently, I ran into some high school friends at a coffee shop in Forsyth Park, people I hadn't seen in years. One of them, Ryan, even though he was only 22, had just moved into his own place and invited us all to check it out. After spending the evening with them, I called Grandma to let her know I'd be staying at her place that night, since I was already in town. She told me she'd leave the key under the third flower pot on the porch, same spot as always. When I said goodbye to my friends, it was already past midnight. Walking through that part of town at that hour, especially when you're not familiar with all the twists and turns, isn't exactly the smartest idea. On my way, we passed a group of guys hanging out near Bull Street, but thankfully, they knew Ryan from somewhere. They chatted for a bit while I kept walking, giving them a quick wave as I headed on. The rest of the walk was eerily quiet. The street was empty and dark, with only the occasional street lamp casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Even the usual night sounds were missing. No cicadas, no distant cars, just an unnatural silence broken only by the faint bass of a party somewhere on River Street. Then I started hearing something strange. It was a low humming, like several people whispering in unison. The sound was getting closer, and it seemed to be coming from behind me. I turned around, but the street was completely empty. Then the sound moved ahead of me, as if it had somehow passed through me. Still, I couldn't see anyone. Confused and getting more uneasy by the second, I picked up my pace. I thought about going back to find Ryan and the others, but I was so close to Grandma's house now, just 2 more blocks. The humming grew clearer, turning into what sounded like chanting. Looking up, I could finally see shapes moving in the darkness ahead. A group of women, maybe 7 or 8 of them, all dressed in long black cloaks or shawls, were walking toward the chapel at the end of the street. They were chanting prayers in low voices as they moved in perfect formation. I broke into a run, nearly tripping on the uneven cobblestones. When I reached Grandma's house, I was shocked to find the front door wide open. She was sitting in her rocking chair by the window, fully dressed and wide awake, completely out of character for someone who's always in bed by 9 o'clock sharp. "What's going on, Grandma? Why are you still up?" I asked, trying to catch my breath. She set down her knitting and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. "I don't like this street when I hear the whispers," she said, and that was all she would say. When I pressed her about who would be praying at the chapel at this hour, she just shook her head and went back to her knitting. The next morning, after coffee and toast, I got ready to head back to Atlanta. As I stepped outside around 7 in the morning, I decided to take another look at the chapel. What I saw made my blood run cold. The building was completely boarded up, not just closed, but sealed shut. Heavy chains with rusty padlocks hung across the doors, and sheets of plywood were nailed over every window. Thick cobwebs stretched across the entrance, and weeds grew waist-high around the foundation. It was obvious that no one had set foot inside that place for months, maybe even years. I hurried back to Grandma's house and knocked on her door. When she answered, I asked her how long the chapel had been abandoned. "Oh, that old place," she said, avoiding my eyes. "Must be going on 2 years now, ever since Reverend Matthews passed. They never did find anyone to take over." I thought about pressing her further, about telling her what I'd seen the night before, but something in her face stopped me. Instead, I just hugged her goodbye and started my drive back to Atlanta. The image of those cloaked figures walking toward an abandoned chapel burned into my mind. To this day, I haven't been able to explain what happened that night. And every time I've tried to bring it up with Grandma since then, she changes the subject so quickly you'd think I'd never spoken at all. Again, at what age did you stop fearing the dark? When we're young, it's common to feel scared, imagining creatures hidden in the night's blackness, watching, waiting, ready to strike. When my grandmother still lived with us, I was around 6 years old. It was during that time I began to feel something watching me inside our house. We lived in a 3-story Victorian home in rural Pennsylvania. The bedrooms and main bathroom were on the 2nd floor, while the living room and kitchen occupied the 1st. Between the top of the staircase and the floor below was the sewing room, as we called it, a space practically abandoned, filled with old furniture and my father's inherited antiques. Whenever I needed to go downstairs for a midnight snack in the kitchen, I'd pass that room with its open door, descend the creaking steps carefully, hesitate before the last one, gather my courage, and race to flip on the lights. I never saw anything inside that room, but I felt with every fiber of my being that something lurked in the darkness, hidden in a corner, watching me. Maybe it was just imagination, the normal fear many children have of the dark. But walking through that hallway without turning on every light was unthinkable. The sensation of being observed was so intense that it convinced me something was there. I even believed I saw a black cat with glowing yellow eyes watching me through the kitchen window. It wasn't the cat itself that terrified me, but the idea that it moved on its own, as if it were alive and aware. Once I told my older brother about this. He took me to the kitchen and showed me that the cat with yellow eyes was actually just a garbage bag with clothespins. That's when I realized the dark concealed nothing more than what was already there during the day. Gradually, I began walking through the house at night without turning on every light. The fear of darkness was disappearing until I turned 8 or 9, when something happened that changed everything. My grandmother had passed away when I was 7. After that, it was just me, my brother, and my father in that big house. On that particular night, my brother was in the kitchen making a grilled cheese sandwich, while I was in the den with my father watching the news before bed. My father asked me to take the dirty clothes from the hamper and put them in the laundry basket in my brother's closet. It was our routine. I never questioned why. I went to my brother's room carrying the clothes. I didn't turn on the light. Fear of the dark was behind me now. I opened the closet and let the clothes fall onto the pile already inside. When I turned to leave, I felt something grab me by the waist. Large, cold, bony hands pulled me forcefully into the closet. What happened next seemed to last forever. Instead of falling onto the clothes, I landed on someone's lap. There were legs beneath me, as if someone were sitting in the darkness. My heart raced, and terror consumed me completely. I fought to get out, clinging to the door and wall desperately, until I managed to break free and run. I rushed to my father's room, crying, screaming that someone was in my brother's closet. My father jumped up, went to check, turned on the lights, and searched the entire room. He found nothing. I kept insisting through sobs that I'd felt someone pull me in. My brother came upstairs at that moment, asking what was happening. After hearing my father explain what I'd said, he looked at me, laughed, and hugged me. "I'm the one who scared you. Calm down, it was just a prank." I could never believe that. We'd been raised to think ghosts were just stories, but it couldn't have been my brother. After my father left his room, I saw my brother walking up the stairs. There was nobody else upstairs except my father and me. It was impossible for him to have been in the room earlier. The fear of darkness returned and stayed with me for several years. Picture a 11-year-old boy switching on every light on his way to the kitchen, then racing upstairs as soon as he turned them off. Much later, during my teenage years, in a conversation about our childhood, my brother confirmed what I'd already suspected. He said he'd probably lied to calm me down, but that he hadn't been the one who scared me that night. He insisted he'd been in the kitchen the entire time. He then suggested that maybe it could have been our grandmother returning to give me one last hug. But I doubt it. If it had been her, I wouldn't have felt that terror, that sensation that something about to swallow me forever in the darkness was poised to strike. I walked the halls of an old Harlem brownstone, my footsteps echoing against floorboards that have seen nearly a century pass. My name's Junior, and they call me a healer. Been doing this work my whole life, just like my mama and her mama before her. Days I'm down at the construction site, but when that sun starts to dip, folks start knocking at my door seeking help with what they can't understand. One October evening, while autumn leaves rattled against my window, there came a soft knock. I opened to find Mrs. Henderson from upstairs with her 16-year-old niece Keisha. The girl stood there, twisting the strap of her school bag, eyes cast down. Keisha was all angles and nervousness, but Mrs. Henderson caught my eye and nodded toward the living room. "You can trust Mr. Junior, baby. He helped me when your uncle passed." Once Keisha settled into my worn leather armchair, I poured us both some mint tea. "What brings you here tonight, child?" She took a shaky breath. "Something's wrong with me, but I can't tell my mama. She'll think I'm losing my mind. Every night, every single night, since my grandmother's birthday passed. She comes to my room." I nodded, encouraging her to continue. "Grandma's been gone 8 years now. But at night, she climbs into my bed and wraps her hands around my throat. I can feel her fingers pressing into my skin. The smell of her denture cream and mothballs fills my nose. Sometimes I wake up choking, and I turn on the light, but she's always gone. Just the marks on my neck remain." The girl pulled down her turtleneck, revealing angry red welts circling her throat like a necklace of bruises. "Mama saw them once. I told her I had nightmares and must have scratched myself in my sleep. She bought it, thank God." I set down my teacup. Something was off about this whole situation. Spirits of loved ones don't typically come to harm their family. I'd seen my share of hauntings, restless souls seeking closure, ancestors delivering warnings, but this felt different. "Tell me about your grandmother. How was she when she was with us?" Keisha's eyes lit up for the first time that evening. "Grandma Rose was the sweetest woman you'd ever meet. She taught me how to braid hair, how to make her famous apple pie. Every Sunday after church, we'd sit on her stoop and she'd tell me stories about when she was young. More peculiar still. I reached for my pouch of herbs and bones, tools I used to sense what's truly happening in the spiritual realm. As I worked, I felt something dark and twisted clinging to Keisha. Not evil, but confused and angry. "Keisha, your grandmother's buried at Woodlawn Cemetery, correct?" She nodded. "I need to tell you something difficult. Your grandmother's spirit isn't at rest. Someone's disturbed her grave, used it for their own purposes. They've summoned her back, but not in the way she should be." The girl's teacup rattled against its saucer. "What do you mean?" "Who would do that? Tomorrow's Saturday. We need to go to her grave, see what's been done there. Can your aunt take us?" "I won't go alone with you, wouldn't be proper." She agreed, though I could see fear warring with hope in her eyes. That night I barely slept. In my years of healing work, I'd seen many things curses meant for revenge, love spells gone wrong, spirits trapped between worlds, but using an innocent's grave as a vessel for dark magic. That was low, even by the standards I'd come to expect. Saturday morning came gray and drizzling. Mrs. Henderson met us at the cemetery gates, her face tight with worry. Woodlawn stretched out before us, acres of marble and memories. We made our way to where Grandma Rose rested, beneath an old oak tree that probably remembered her as a young woman. The headstone looked undisturbed at first glance, but as I ran my hands along its base, I found it a small opening carefully concealed. Inside, someone had stuffed what looked like a garbage bag. The smell hit me first: rotting meat, sour milk, things that had no business near the dead. You ladies might want to step back for this part. I pulled out the bag. Inside was a collection of items that made my stomach turn, not because of what they were, but because of what they meant. Pictures of a man unknown to Keisha's family. Pieces of his clothing, hair, nail clippings, and written instructions for a curse meant to destroy him. Someone had chosen this grave simply because it was accessible, dragging poor Grandma Rose into their vendetta. I worked quickly, destroying everything with blessed salt and prayers. But something still didn't sit right. Why would Grandma Rose attack Keisha? The girl hadn't done anything wrong. As I cleaned the grave, I noticed something else. Another set of items hidden deeper. These were different. Baby hair, school photos, mementos that clearly belonged to Keisha. My blood ran cold as understanding dawned. Keisha, did anyone ever have issue with your grandmother? Any old family feuds? The girl thought for a moment. Well, there was this falling out years ago. My great-aunt Bee and Grandma Rose hadn't spoken in decades. Something about a man they both loved when they were young. Everything clicked into place. The attack wasn't from Grandma Rose at all. Someone had bound her spirit, forced her to carry out attacks against her own granddaughter. The cruelty of it made my heart ache. I performed an exorcism right there on the grave, releasing Grandma Rose's spirit from the bindings that held her. As the words of release left my lips, I felt a shift in the air, like a sigh of relief from somewhere beyond. Mrs. Henderson drove us home in silence. Keisha stared out the window, processing everything. At her doorstep, I gave her a protection charm and specific prayers to say each night. Your grandmother's free now, child. The attacks will stop. 6 weeks passed without another visit from Keisha. I took that as a good sign. But one evening, she appeared at my door again, this time with fresh chocolate chip cookies. They stopped, she said simply. The marks, the dreams, all of it. But sometimes, late at night, I smell her perfume, the good kind, not the mothballs. Like she's checking on me. That's how it should be, child. After she left, I sat in my armchair, thinking about all the souls resting in woodlawn and cemeteries across the city. How many were undisturbed? How many were being used as pawns in battles they never chose? I finished my tea and prepared for my evening clients. The work of a healer never truly ends. We just try to set things right, one spirit at a time. In my years of healing, I've learned that the dead don't always stay quiet, but they should be left to rest in peace. Visit your loved ones' graves, not just on Memorial Day or birthdays. Check on them, say a prayer, make sure no one's using their memory for purposes they'd never approve of. The living have enough battles to fight without dragging the dead into them. It was a minute past midnight on a frigid November evening in Edinburgh, and Finlay MacDonagh sat alone in his office. From 15 stories below, he could hear the raucous laughter of pub-goers spilling onto the cobblestone streets. From what he could make out, the crowd below was in good spirits. Loud, boisterous laughing and drunken singing echoed upward. Finlay allowed himself a small smile. It was good to hear happy voices, even from a distance. He sat in the dark, trying to cherish the warm feeling for a few moments. Then his phone lit up and vibrated against the ancient oak desk where he had left it. Finlay read the message, a notification from the car service. His driver had arrived. He stood up and took one last look around his office. A massive room 14 feet from floor to ceiling, with the entire northern wall made of thick glass panes. The office was ostentatious for a workplace, indulgent in decoration and conspicuous in location. The room's massive windows were perfectly suited to flood the room with the scarce Scottish sunlight during the day. But in the black of night, they revealed the distant lights of a restless city. Even after 8 years, Finlay still felt alone in the city at night. Lights of the endless stone buildings revealed the uncountable silhouettes of Edinburgh's ancient architecture. The darkened office sat on the 16th floor of the towering granite building. Finlay hated this place. He had spent nearly every day of the past 8 years in the confines of this office, but nothing about this place was his. It was his father's office, not his, the office, the entire floor it was located on, and the archaeological foundation that owned it were all his father's. Finlay had only followed the old man here, but he would go on no longer. His father was dead, and Finlay was leaving this place forever. He had found out about his father's death the previous Monday, and had spent the last week handling the old man's business. The memories of the days spent handling the will began to crowd in on him, but Finlay pushed them aside. That was enough, he thought as he took one last look over the cavernous office. It was over, he thought to himself. He never had to think about the man again. With that thought, Finlay turned around, picked up his rucksack which he had left lying by the door, and exited the darkened office. Finlay made his way across a sea of antique Persian rugs and looked out at the horizon of desks and display cases. The entire floor was silent, but for the humming of the climate control system and the distant sound of typing. Someone else was here. There always was at this hour. Someone who either didn't want to go home or had nothing to go back to. That person had once been him, Finlay admitted to himself, but never again. His father had seen to that. When Finlay reached the elevators, he pressed the button and watched the brass G flicker to life. The young man shouldered his rucksack and settled for a minute of waiting. With a momentary pause, thoughts of his father returned. When he had seen the will, Finlay had thought that in death, his father had finally done him a kindness. The old man had left him nearly everything. Finlay had been left a sizable inheritance, all his father's possessions, nearly everything except a place in the foundation. When he had seen that, Finlay had felt immense relief. It seemed at last that his father had come to know him. He hated archaeology, he hated the foundation, and most of all, he hated Edinburgh. With the old man's death, Finlay had been freed. The elevator dinged as it finished its ascent, and as its burnished doors opened, Finlay returned to the present moment and stepped inside. when the doors closed behind him and he felt himself begin to descend, another thought came to the young man. Who made you come here in the first place? That question tore away any pretenses of warmth from his late father. It was the old man, after all, who had made him come to the city in the first place. The elevator continued its slow descent, and the young man stewed. It was his father who made him go to university for archaeology. His father who forced him out of their home in the Highlands, and his father who brought him to Edinburgh. The elevator doors opened again, and Finley stepped out into the lobby. The foundation building had a grand entryway. The vaulted ceilings were adorned with Celtic knotwork, and intricate medieval patterns were etched into its massive stone walls. Everything about the place seemed wrong to Finley, from the falsity of electric lights, made to look like gas lamps overhead, down to the polished stone beneath his feet. The young man sped up to reach his car before it left. He only slowed down when he reached the lobby's front desk, which was still manned even in the late hours. Finley stopped a moment and nodded toward the night doorman. The other man nodded back, and the pair of them exchanged a wordless goodbye. And with that, Finley MacDonagh stepped out into the biting November night. The street was nearly empty. The revelers he had heard minutes before had by now moved on. The night seemed to be void of all life save for the young man, and a few tourists waiting for the lights to change at the corner. It was eerie for Edinburgh, even at midnight. Finley pulled his wool coat a little tighter around his chest against the cold, and looked around for his driver. He saw his car waiting for him at the curb, and when he approached, a voice called out from the open driver's seat window. "Edinburgh Airport," the voice asked. Finley didn't reply. He only nodded and stepped inside the cab. He hadn't even finished buckling his seat belt before the car sped off down the Royal Mile. He watched the familiar gray views of the previous 8 years flash by as they drove, pubs and offices, gift shops and museums. All began to dissipate into a stone flurry as the city blocks blurred and melted under the soft glow of streetlights and against the rush of tires on ancient cobblestones. Finley watched the city lights from the car window for a moment before turning away and checking his phone. It would be another 20 minutes before they reached the Edinburgh airport. The cab turned again, and the young man stifled a yawn as he leaned against his seat. The lights continued to flash overhead, and the city sights flew past him. But Finley MacDonagh had stopped watching. Despite his best efforts, the lack of sleep had taken its toll, and the young man dozed off into a restless sleep. When he opened his eyes, he saw a room empty of life and covered in a thick blanket of heavy darkness. He was in a bed, and as he looked around, he noticed more. He saw a carved wooden chest, a small child-sized chair, and an open window. The window had been propped open, but there was no moonlight to be seen, and in the black of that unnatural light, even the light of the stars seemed somehow dimmed. Beyond the fluttering curtains, he could barely make out the familiar shape of ancient Scots pines, standing tall and poised like watchful sentinels in the night. There was hardly a sound on that winter night, nothing at all except for the rustling of curtains in the northern wind. Just then the silence was broken. Finley heard the sound of something scraping against stone from outside the window, and he whipped his head around to look. Where moments before he had glimpsed only a wall of trees, he could now see a woman standing in the window. The woman grasped the open window sill. Her long nails dug into the soft stone with a strength and pressure that showed in the expressed blue veins that throbbed against her skin. She wore a long, faded white gown that, to Finley's terror, bore a massive dried russet stain across the middle of its ruined facade. The woman looked up at him through wild amber eyes, her face a canvas for the purest of animal terror. And for a moment, she simply stared at the man. Then she let loose a terrible scream. The wail echoed through the darkened room with the force of hurricane winds. The curtains blew, and Finley felt a paralyzing, deadly fear course through his veins. He felt his heart would burst, and he would die if he had to listen to that awful wailing a minute longer. He then felt a hand grab his shoulder. Finley's eyes flew open, and he gasped for breath. He was back in the cab, with his back against the door. They weren't moving, and by the sounds he heard from outside, he had reached the airport. His driver was turned away from the wheel and had his hand on Finley's shoulder, a look of concern written across his face. "Are you all right, lad? We're at the airport," he said in a thick Scottish brogue. Finley tried to catch his breath. His heart was beating out of control, and he noticed that he was clutching his chest. He drew his hand back to his side and pushed away the driver. The young man collected himself and then spoke. "I'm fine. I just need to catch my flight." The driver gave him a disbelieving look, but seemed to take Finley at his word. They left the car without another word. The driver helped him with his luggage, and then got back in the car and drove away. Edinburgh Airport was awash with noise. Airplane engines roared overhead through the cold night. The crowd of travelers which spilled out of the wide glass doors and into the drop-off lot droned with distant conversation, but Finley heard none of it. His mind lingered on the dream. Despite what he had seen, he was not afraid. The fear seemed distant at the airport. The young man felt a peculiar safety amidst the crowd, and he was content to linger beneath the glare of artificial lights. Finley's mind remained fixed on the dream, but his tired body moved forward. He had a flight to catch, and so he moved on, moving mechanically through check-ins and towards his terminal. But as he navigated the unending lines and the stalwart bureaucratic barriers of security, the man's mind continued to wander. He realized why the experience in the cab had entranced him so. He had dreamt of the woman in white before. Her piercing scream was familiar. He had heard it many times. He remembered the great trees bending in the force of the unnatural wind that came with the woman's presence. Finley remembered the room as well. He knew the carved chest and the tiny chair. Indeed, he could never forget his childhood bedroom in Castle Macdonogh. There was something else, something he was missing. His memories of those dreams were constant. The woman, bloody and wretched, her screaming, and the wild look in her eyes, they all remained fixed in his memory. But these memories, as brutal as they were, never ended with fear. There was something he was missing. At the edge of memory, in the fog of his unconscious mind, Finley knew there was more to his dream. He remembered waking up, remembered crying, screaming for help. He was starting to recall. There was always an answer to his pleading, a reassuring voice, a calming presence. The soft voice of his mother. The thought struck the young man with a terrible force. He had not thought of his mother in years, not since she had been sent away. He hadn't even spared the time to visit when, years earlier, he had gotten the news that she had been committed to a permanent care facility. He knew that there had been a good reason to forget the woman. These vague, half-recollected thoughts of her calming voice paled in comparison to the innumerable memories of manic episodes and hours of screaming matches with his father. He scowled. These recollections had reopened old wounds, and he was beginning to stew in the righteous anger of a wounded child. He would have gone on like that for hours, uninterrupted, but he was abruptly returned to reality as his reminiscing was cut short by the listless commanding of a security agent. He had reached the front of the line, and as he took in the metal detectors before him, he forced his exhausted mind to contend with the here and now. It took nearly an hour to get through airport security, and by the time the exhausted traveler had stepped into the terminal, boarding had already begun for his flight. As he joined with the line that had already begun to form, he absent-mindedly checked his phone. No new messages. That was not surprising, but still disappointing. Finley had reached out to all his old friends from university. A few of them had started families. Most of them had moved away. And it seemed that the remaining few wanted nothing to do with him. He tried to tell himself that this was fine. He had one thing to deal with, and one thing only: the castle and all that came with it. The plane ride to Inverness from Edinburgh was short, only 45 minutes, but to Finley it felt like an eternity. Despite his exhaustion, he did not dare fall asleep. He did not want to return to that dream, not until he had to. Instead, he sat in his window seat, fighting a losing battle against sleep deprivation and resentment. Resentment against his friends for forgetting him. Resentment against his father for taking him from his home in the first place. But most of all, Finley resented himself for allowing the old man to do it. The various grievances began to morph and fold in on one another in the hot forge of his exhausted mind, until the reason and subject of his anger became obscured. He was left with only a deep unease and a question. He needed to know what it was his mother had said to him all those years ago. As the plane began its descent, and the vastness of the highlands came into view beneath the cloud cover, the question seemed to grow a sense of urgency. The darkness had fallen completely when Finley joined the other passengers in leaving the plane. Inverness Airport was small, consisting of one modest terminal and containing just one little cafe which had not yet opened for the day. The traveler left the terminal behind quickly, making his way purposefully towards the airport parking lot. Before he had left Edinburgh, he had made arrangements to lease a rental car for the few weeks he intended to stay in the Highlands as he handled his father's affairs. It didn't take long to find the car company's representative. After a few quick words with him behind the counter and the exchange of a few documents, Finley got the car and its keys and was back on the road. He had remembered the drive from the airport to his family home was beautiful. The natural beauty of the Highlands, even this close to Scotland's northernmost city, was unmatched in his view. To his adult eyes, however, the traveler thought there was something deeply sinister about the thick forest that crowded in on both sides of the lonely strip of road. The mighty pine trees, which had once radiated such calm as they rose like steady watchers against the sky, now seemed to leer ominously down at the young man. The drive to the old castle was not long. and in a matter of moments, his destination rose up on the road ahead. Finley knew he was approaching his old home when the forest road turned sharply upwards. Soon enough, the rough asphalt of the public road turned to ancient packed dirt. The free mountain air that flew through the car's open window seemed to turn impossibly stagnant and sickly as he watched the wild northern heather fall to a craggy courtyard, and the rows of venerable pine trees surrendered to bare stone walls. With one final turn in the winding road, Finley's spirits fell, and by the feeling, he knew that he was home. A great stone courtyard spread out ahead of him, long neglected with weeds and thistles growing between the cracks. The rugged landscape extended for yards in front of him, ending only at the very doorstep to his family home. Castle MacDonagh had been built on the low jutting cliffs that formed sporadically around the shores of Loch Doine. The old household did not stand proudly on the cliffside. Instead, it crouched. The building was still and hunched, full of coiled tension, like an ancient beast ready to leap into the water below. The traveler hated being home, but despite this, he felt a sense of relief. At last, his destination loomed up before him. His travels were over for now. Finley brought his car to a stop in the massive circular courtyard that lay just beyond the doorstep and looked up into the darkened facade. As the young man closed the car door behind him and walked up the steps to the familiar entrance, he felt strangely at ease. Everything was exactly as he had left it years ago. The stone gargoyles sat clean and upright, unoccupied but not abandoned. Finley thought for a moment why his father had kept both the groundskeeper and the housekeeper on payroll to care for a castle no one lived in. He thought it might be time to let them go, but he pushed the thought away. Such consideration was not one to take lightly, and he was far too tired to make a real decision about other people's livelihoods. Still, finding the castle in such a familiar state was a pleasant surprise. One of the few pleasant surprises his father had provided him, even if it was posthumous. Finley cracked a smile at the thought, and with that, he produced the key to the front door. He had been given the keys to the family home by his father's longtime solicitor on the same day he had learned of the old man's death. In truth, he had been surprised that he hadn't sold the castle. He had said as much to the solicitor, but at that, the young man had been reminded. This castle had been in his family for generations. When Finley pushed the key into the lock and swung open the front door, he was immediately reminded of the castle's antiquity by what lay inside. He stepped into the old castle's musty entryway. The walls were lined with tapestries and portraits. He saw locks and landscapes painted in expert style, along with the countenances of long-dead MacDonaghs, frozen forever in oil and canvas. Beautiful carpets extended far into the long hallway, decorated with complex Celtic knots and patterns. As he walked further into the castle, he came to the grand hall. The hall was massive, dominated by a grand fireplace, and complete with great stone pillars extending to a vaulted ceiling. There was so much space, but the room was congested. Old and overly ornate chairs cluttered every corner. Ancient shields and weapons blocked foot traffic in every direction, and countless curios sat on cluttered countertops. Finley didn't consider any of them his. His father had taken great care to explain the significance of every one of the innumerable family artifacts kept in the castle. He remembered lectures on the stories behind the old Gaelic manuscripts his great-grandfather had bought centuries ago from the monasteries, the Viking drinking horns his great-uncle had recovered from a dig in Orkney, and many, many more. None of it had ever mattered to Finley. To him, it was all nothing more than priceless junk. There was only one keepsake in that museum of a great hall that interested the young man. Above the mantel hung a portrait. It depicted a man of fearsome appearance. He had a head of fiery red hair and a hard countenance, and wore a plaid typical of his 18th century setting. But it was his eyes that captivated the young man. They were shards of ice blue, cold and white blue like Finley's own. To see them reflected in the painting, however, was a terrible thing. The man looked possessed entirely by hate, even in what was ostensibly a flattering portrait. Finley had always hated the painting. As a child, he had once asked his father who the man in the portrait was. His father had told him with pride. The man was his namesake, his great-great-great-grandfather, also named Finley MacDonagh. To hear his father tell the story, their long-dead ancestor had come down from the Northern Isles in the 18th century to take advantage of the trade in wool and whiskey. The late Finley MacDonagh had done so well that he had bought a plot of land from local crofters and built their family home. Finley remembered his father had always seemed so proud when he told that story. But as he looked around the lifeless great hall and considered his father's collection of useless keepsakes, the young man felt only disappointment. The castle was full of history. Surely some of these artifacts were even valuable, but not to the younger MacDonagh. He sighed and turned away from the portrait's hateful gaze. He made his way to the back exit of the great hall, but as he did, something caught his eye. Sitting on a small pedestal to the side of the back door was a long and ornate glass case. Within the case was an ancient-looking claymore, a great two-handed sword with a jeweled hilt. There was something that Finley hated about the old sword. He remembered asking his father what the weapon was and why it was there. The old man proudly told him it belonged to his ancestor. The blade had been the older Finley's war sword, but as he stared into the polished steel, he knew the blade was not for battle. A chill ran down the young man's spine despite being indoors, and he quickly left the great hall behind, eager to stop thinking about the portrait and the old sword. Finally, Finley stopped at the door of his childhood bedroom. Pushing the door open, he was surprised to see it entirely the same. He hadn't stepped foot in this room for almost 10 years, and in that time, it seemed nothing at all had changed. The carved chest, the little chair, even his bed, all of it was just as he had left it. He walked over to his bed, still made up in clean linen sheets. Finley sat down. He remembered how afraid he had felt in this place. In the daylight, he had hidden away here from his parents' screaming arguments. But no matter how bad the days would get, the nights were always worse. Finley looked up at the window. He could see the pine trees standing tall and dark, and he saw the black waters of Loch Doine sparkling in the faint moonlight under the zenith of a November sky. The view was picturesque, like a romantic painting, but he saw none of this beauty. All he could think of was the woman from his dreams, pale and bloody beneath the cold moon. He tried to shake the memories from his tired mind. He turned away from the window and tried to tell himself that they were all just nightmares. Finley forced himself to focus on something else. He tried to recall what happened next. What would happen when he woke from these nightmares each night? Staring at the stone floor, he tried to remember, and he thought of his mother. He would wake from his dreams, and there she would be, standing at his bedside, ready to reassure him. She would always ask him what was wrong, and he would tell her about the woman who would, by now, be gone from the window. Now at last, sitting in the room where the words had been spoken, Finley remembered what his mother had said to him. She would hush him, stroke his hair, and wrap him in the tightest of hugs. Then she would say, "She was only keening, my wee bairn. Spirits don't need to be fearsome. Maybe she just needs help. Maybe she just needs you to know that she's there and to understand her pain." Now, as an adult, alone with the memories, it all seemed completely absurd. Finley wondered if his mother had believed those things she said about the spirits. In the end, he wanted to know if she had still thought that understanding would solve everything after the real monster had made a weapon out of doctors and psychiatrists and had locked her away in a facility. What did it matter anyway? Nothing his mother had ever told him had held much weight anyway. She had been a dangerous hysteric. At least that's what his father had said. But he was dead now, and she was locked away. Only Finley remained, alone in that castle. Just him and his memories. The traveler stood up. He had decided that he would waste no more time on the past, and so he left his luggage where it lay. He exited his childhood bedroom and headed back out towards the car. It was the middle of the night, and he still had many things to do before morning would come, and he would get his well-deserved rest. Finley drove back down the hill and into the town of Inverness. His father had left him a castle, but one empty of food and, more importantly, whiskey. Finley would have need of both if he wanted to get through the 2 weeks he would have to spend in the Highlands. The grocery and liquor store were not far from each other, and in truth, he didn't need to spend much time at either of them, but nevertheless, he lingered. The traveler spent hours at both stores, meandering aimlessly in the aisles, and staring without consideration at rows of bottles. Finley told himself that he was lingering around town in hopes of seeing a familiar face, but he knew in his heart that this wasn't true. He didn't want to see his friends, if indeed any of them remained. He just didn't want to go back home. When he finally did return to his car, his whiskey and groceries in tow, he fumbled with his keys and waited in the parking lot. When he drove back, he drove the speed limit and took every wrong turn he could think of. By the time he finally came to the old earthen drive of Castle Macdonough, it was the early morning, and the winter moon had begun to dip below the western mountains. He walked inside as quickly as he could. He walked the halls of his family home with a purpose, not sparing a moment's glance towards anything but his destination. He reached the kitchen quickly and set his bag down on the table. He liked the kitchen. It may have been the only place in the castle. He had warm feelings towards it all. The room had been a modern addition to the old castle. It had a large window with a clear view of the loch, and had been designed by his mother when she had married his father. This was the only place in the whole building bereft of history. No tapestries hung on its walls, and no storied artifacts decorated its shelves. It was a world of modern appliances, granite countertops, and shimmering pots and pans. Finley took a pot down from the shelving filled it with water, and set it to boil. He sat down and watched the shadows of early morning cast themselves against the darkening waters of the loch. The nature surrounding the old castle was beautiful, and for the first time that day, Finley allowed himself to appreciate that. He watched the waves churn gently in the waters below, and he listened for the wind rustling softly in the pines. His mind began to wander with the wind, and images floated across his unconscious mind. He saw visions of a house on the loch side. It was much smaller than his, built in a crude and old-fashioned style, but it was unquestionably in the same spot that he now sat. He saw fields outside of it and heard the bleating of sheep in the air. There was a woman with long raven hair and deep green eyes. He watched her as she went about her life, tending to the animals, mending clothes, and eating dinner alone in her cottage by the loch. It was idyllic, a beautiful image, but it was soon to be shattered. An alarm rang out from Finley's phone. The pasta was ready, and his visions were ripped from him, gone as quickly as they had come. The young man ate his meal in silence. He watched the night turn to dawn, but his mind was not on the view or his food. He thought only of the little cottage. It seemed so appropriate to him. The castle his family had built was too big for where it was. It blotted out the beauty of the horizon with its grossness, and polluted the landscape with its ostentation. Standing in the midst of generations of overindulgence, Finley was enraptured by the vision of that woman contented with her sheep and her cottage by the loch shore. By the time he had finished his meal, the sun had begun to rise. Alone on the cliff by the loch in an empty castle, the only light for miles around was the overhead light above him. After years spent in Edinburgh, the darkness outside the window seemed impenetrable. The rural night felt heavy all around him. Finley also felt the weight of his exhaustion. He hadn't slept in over 24 hours, and it was starting to show. He got up, finished his drink, and headed back to his childhood bedroom to get his luggage. He needed to find his toothbrush, brush his teeth, and sleep. Still, even as he walked, his mind wandered back to the little cottage. And it was not until he finally reached the old bedroom that something brought him back to reality. To his surprise, when he reached the old room, he found the door ajar, swaying in the wind. Looking further inside the darkened room, he saw more. The bedroom window had been opened. He felt cold fear run down his back. He knew he hadn't left this door open, and he certainly hadn't touched the window. He mustered up his courage and went into the room, towards the open window. Finley pushed his head outside and looked around. There was nothing. He couldn't see anything but the trees bending and groaning in the wind. He told himself that he must have left the window open. The room had been terribly musty, and he'd left it open to air it out. He scanned the forest for a second time and saw nothing. The explanations he gave were beginning to make sense, and he could feel his hammering heart begin to slow to a normal pace. Finley was ready to accept the story when he looked down at the window sill. There in the soft stone, he saw dozens of long, deep scratches. Some of them seemed quite old, but others were alarmingly recent. Stray bits of stone and dust indicated that as recently as last night, taloned hands had reached in through the window and grasped at the room within. At the sight of the ghastly markings on the sill, memories of his recurring childhood nightmares came flooding back. The woman in white, her bloody dress, and baleful eyes. He had dreamed of her each and every night, watched her as she stared into the windows, her nails digging into the window sill. He had had the dream again after 10 long years. He had seen her again just as he was returning home. A single thought echoed throughout his empty mind. Had it all been real? The wind began to howl in the pines outside, as the gale screamed its fury out across the black expanse of Loch Doine. Finlay MacDonagh sat in silence at the revelation. He stared for an unbroken minute at the deep gashes in the stone. Then the bare reality crashed upon him like a wave. It was real. What could it do to him? He answered the question in the only way that seemed sensible. He turned and bolted out of the room, slamming the door behind him and abandoning his luggage. The last living MacDonagh took off running down the long, meandering halls of his family castle. Finlay could hear the wind screaming on high as he ran. It didn't sound like wind anymore. He realized that it never had. The night air was alive with the sound of mournful, hateful, and all too terrifying human keening. The sound was so terrible, and with it came visions. He saw a shape in the woods, the burning torches, and finally, the flash and bite of a blade. Finlay tried to shake the images from his mind, and refocused on the light of the kitchen, which was now well in view. He ran faster as the light grew closer, and by the time he crossed the threshold into the modern room, he was sprinting. It was then, as he saw sanctuary fall in around him, that Finlay felt his bare feet slip on the tile, and he fell to the ground. He fell face forward and put his leg out in front of him. His knee collided with the tile, and white-hot pain shot through his leg as he crumpled into a limp heap on the floor. He was in a lot of pain, but Finlay didn't stay on the ground. Instead, with a wince and an expletive, he forced himself back to his feet. The shrieking continued outside, and as he balanced himself against the counter, he saw that sheets of rain had begun to lash the glass of the window. There was a flash of lightning overhead, and for a moment, the sprawling grounds of Castle MacDonagh were entirely illuminated. There, through the driving rain and against the groaning pines, Finlay saw a woman's silhouette amongst the trees. The glimpse was gone in an instant, and the forest was plunged back into darkness. He heard thunder boom in the night sky as he leaned against the granite countertop, reeling in pain. He refused to give himself a moment to recover. He knew that he had to get out. As the wind wailed its lamentations on high, the last heir of the castle grabbed his car keys off the counter and forced himself to limp forward. Finlay struggled slowly and desperately through the dark castle until at last he reached the great double doors and heaved them open. The doors flew open with the force of the storm, their handles forcing themselves free of the young man's grasp. The vastness of heather and night loomed before him, obstructed by the downpour. He swooned in the electric air of the storm, and his arms shot out for the stone railings, steadying himself. He looked out again. He realized everything looked different in the lively, wet air. The effects of his wrecked knee and the whiskey he had at dinner began to meld with his exhaustion. He looked down at his keys and remembered that he hadn't slept in 2 days. Finlay turned back towards the storm. The rain was cold, and the wailing wind was bitter. Why was he so desperate anyway? Because he had seen scratches in the stone. He told himself that that could have been left by animals. He told himself that he was, by now, a city dweller that had no real idea what went on in the country at all. Why was he standing out there well past midnight, barefoot in a vicious thunderstorm? He was drunk, he was tired, and he was clearly seeing things. At least that's what Finley had decided to tell himself. Stabbing pain continued to lay siege to his exhausted mind, and the man continued to rationalize. His eyes were heavy, and his vision was blurred. Even when lightning flashed again, the looming figure of a woman again appeared in the forest. Finley ignored it. When the thunder crashed moments later, he let the crashing sound chase what he had seen from his mind. He looked at his car keys for the last time. They swam in his gaze. He knew that he was in no shape to drive. Lightning crashed again, but Finley did not turn to look. Nothing he saw would change anything. The last McDonough turned around and limped back through the door of his family home. He heard the door slam shut behind him and stared out into the darkness of his home. He had to sleep, and so he struggled dutifully back towards the kitchen. The youth found the bottle of whiskey where he had left it next to his half-eaten dinner. He took a swig to deal with the pain, and then, with a wince, slammed the bottle back down on the counter. Then he stumbled towards the great hall. The youth ignored the wailing winds and shrieking pines, and shut his eyes to the flashing lightning, allowing the wrath of the storm to rock him to sleep. When he finally slipped into a fitful sleep, Finley opened his eyes to the world of a tenuous dream, and he saw once again the sight of a little cottage standing on a cliff by the loch side. He smelt wet earth and smoke in his nostrils. He heard bleating sheep and the crashing of waves on the rock. He looked forward and saw that he held a torch in an old, gnarled, and unfamiliar fist. In his other hand, he held a claymore, the one he remembered from his great hall. The sword's jeweled hilt flashed in the torchlight. Finley steadied himself. He knew the object of his desire lay at the end of the dirt path ahead. He walked with purpose upon the unkempt and rambling path. When he finally reached the summit, he saw the despicable little cottage hunched against the glorious horizon. He hated this place. He hated the woman who lived there, as he had hated her husband. He had meant to build a castle to fit his station on this spot. He fumed as he walked. Finley felt that he had a right to his anger. After all, he had made many generous offers for the land that these peasants were at present polluting with their wretched croft. The husband had flatly refused, telling him that this was his land, and he wouldn't sell. Well, Finley had seen to that difficulty. The husband had disappeared on his weekly drive down to the town for the market. Finley flashed a toothy grin as he thought about his role in arranging the crofter's death. He had thought that this would solve his problem, but the woman had been uncooperative. Finley had noticed the wife on his first visit to the farmstead. She was young and very beautiful. He had wanted her from the first. When he had disposed of her husband, Finley had thought that he could take both the land and the woman, but she had refused him and spat in his face. He grimaced at the memory of humiliation, but gripped the hilt of his sword and grew giddy in the anticipation of the satisfaction he knew was to come. Finley was almost out of breath when he reached the summit of the cliff. He saw the wild heather of the savage, untamed land, illuminated in the light of the blue moon. Before him in the night, the sheep began to bleat as the sound of his heavy footfalls disturbed their rest. Finley thought of the Laird of Inverness, thought of the sheriff and the bribes he had offered, and of the promises they had given him. He was smiling now. No one could stop him. He saw a flickering light through the cottage window. This was good. He wanted the woman alert for what was to come. Finlay MacDonagh hurried forward towards the doorstep and pounded on the flimsy wooden door. After a minute of furious banging, he felt the door swing open and give way. In its place, he saw the woman appear, her black hair unkempt and flying in the winter wind, her wild eyes filled with a pleasing terror. He had meant to excoriate the impudent creature, to read her a list of every reason why this was happening, to punish her properly for her defiance. But he couldn't. He let his rage get the better of him, and before he could say a word, he was seized by a wild and oppressive fury. The laird thrust the point of his claymore through her nightgown and heard it pierce her soft midsection. He heard a sickly wet crunch as he pulled the blade free of his victim. She fell to the floor. There was a moment of silence. Then the woman began to scream. She wailed and shrieked her defiance in a language that Finlay could not understand. He didn't need to hear her words to know the woman's intention. Even as she bled her lifeblood on the floor of her home, she shouted her opposition. Despite an increasing lack of air in her lungs, she heaved her refusal. The sight enraged the laird. He had come demanding her rightful submission. But even at this painful end, the witch's forked tongue still dripped in rebellion and spat out only curses. It took only a flick of his wrist to silence her. Finlay watched in satisfaction as his cold steel opened the woman's throat. Her wailing turned to gurgling, and her defiance was silenced as blood welled up in the canal he had left in her windpipe. Finlay still burned with hatred as he watched the light die in her dark eyes. He heard thunder rumble over the loch as he turned to leave the cottage. The pines groaned against the shrieking wind as a storm began to take shape in the east. The laird was fuming. The rain might wash the woman's blood from the ground, but he would not forget this. He would not let the witch rest peacefully. She would be punished for her defiance, if not in this life, then in the next. Finlay MacDonagh made a vow to the shrieking wind. He swore that he would lay the foundations of his household over the woman's broken bones. He would build a monument to power, a mausoleum for his family and all who stood against him. The castle that would be built over these ruins on the cliffside would command the skyline for generations to come. The thunder crashed and the rain began to pour. He looked over the wild heather and huddled sheep for another moment. And then, with a flash of lightning, Finlay MacDonagh opened his eyes. The first thing he noticed was that he was in terrible pain. Finlay swore as he sat up in the massive and uncomfortable chair he had fallen asleep in. He looked out across his dark great hall. He saw the grand fireplace directly in front of him. Atop the mantel, the portrait of his namesake, the first Finlay MacDonagh, stared back at his descendant through hateful, icy blue eyes. The younger MacDonagh turned away from the portrait with disgust. Something in its eyes brought back the memories of a most revolting dream. Looking for anything else to focus on, the youth turned his eyes toward the window. It was dark outside. Rain battered the window, and precious little sunlight made it through the black clouds that hung heavy overhead. Distant thunder rumbled in the mountains, and lightning lit up the horizon. Finlay shielded his eyes and looked down at his phone. He saw a severe thunderstorm warning displayed, and then he noticed that it was 1:30 in the afternoon. Finally, Finley saw that he had no cell service. With his misery compounded threefold, the young man groaned and cursed at himself. The groundskeeper was supposed to be here at 2, and he had left the castle a mess. Finley pushed himself out of the chair, and memories of the previous night began to come back to him piecemeal. He tried to push them aside, and when he saw the still-open whiskey bottle on the kitchen counter, he found a worthy scapegoat for what he assured himself were hallucinations. Finley limped past the liquor and uneaten food and came to the landline. He picked it up, ready to call his father's old groundskeeper, when he heard, to his increasing dread, the line was dead. The storm must have brought down the phone lines in the night. The youth swore again and tried to come up with any idea as to what to do next. He had less than an hour before the groundskeeper was supposed to show up. But as he looked out at the raging storm, Finley MacDonagh was beginning to suspect that his guest would never arrive. It was an uncomfortable thought. After the night he'd had, he thought it would have been a great comfort to see another living person. He sat down in one of the kitchen chairs, relief flooding his lower body as he took his full weight off his damaged knee. Despite the pain and enduring exhaustion, it only took a moment for a strange restlessness to set in, and Finley was back on his feet. He realized that he could not stand to look outside. He heard the wailing cries of the woman in every groaning pine tree, saw her twisted silhouette in every darkened corner, and felt her damning gaze wherever he sat for more than a moment. Finley spent the next hour pacing the halls of Castle MacDonagh, chased from room after room by raucous thunder, and driven ever onward by the steady drumbeat of rain on the walls. He told himself that the previous night's events had been the understandable results of exhaustion and grief taking their full toll. Rationalizing further, he reaffirmed his earlier notion that the claw marks on the stone had been the work of some animal or another. And in his delirium, he had overreacted. Finley told himself all this, but somewhere within, the man knew it wasn't true. He had not grieved for his father, and no matter how tired or drunk he had been, Finley MacDonagh knew that the things he had seen, the things that he had dreamed, were real. Somewhere deep in his subconscious, the man made a decision. He knew that even if he were to try and run, he wouldn't get far. His leg was in no condition to allow him to flee. And if the storm had knocked out the telephones, then there was no telling what shape the roads would be in. No, he could not run. But if he were to stave off debilitating panic, Finley knew that he could not admit to himself that there was a reason to fear. After all, the last heir and namesake of Finley MacDonagh would not be leaving the old castle that night. Once he had accepted this reality, he grew deaf to the wailing in the woods. The youth turned his eyes from the windows and ignored the crooked, bloody figure, who, even in the light of the day, now watched him from the trees. Finley continued his painful, manic, and yet constant pace through the halls of his family home. He passed the closed doors of opulent bedrooms and luxurious baths, but he opened no doors. The traveler saw walls lined with tapestries and photographs brought back to the castle from all over the world by generations of now-dead MacDonaghs. He thought that he had been wrong to ever think of the castle as a home. This place, littered with the refuse of long-extinguished lives, was a mausoleum and nothing more. He spent hours in this manner, pacing the halls and shutting out the world. He walked until the sun had set over the mountains, and he found himself again standing in the great hall beneath the hateful blue eyes of his namesake. It was a minute past midnight, and Finlay MacDonagh stood alone, wounded and desperate in the lightless expanse of his family home. He saw the relics of 4 generations spread out around him, and looked up into the painted eyes of the man who had built for them their household. He wondered for a brief moment, what would he bring back here? What testament would be left to tell of his life? What would his children bring back here? The wind continued to wail, and in desperation, Finlay looked to the silent portrait of his ancestor for guidance. He knew what awaited him in the woods, and he understood that he could not escape it. The face of his ancestor, frozen in time, gave only one answer. The spirits of hatred and violence declared themselves brazenly in his ancient and eternal glare. Finlay tried to take solace in the violence he saw all around him. It was through brutality that this land had been won, and if he were to escape, it would be through these means that he had inherited. He turned away from the portrait, and there, across the room, he saw his deliverance. It lay in its glass case, glimmering and cruel as it had been left for centuries, his ancestor's claymore, the jeweled hilt still intact. The screaming wind reached a fever pitch, and the youth began to feel as if his ears would burst under the pressure. But against all nature's wrath, he made his way towards the weapon. When he looked upon the sword, he saw the flames of long-gone years dance across the polished steel. He fumbled with the lock as he opened the case, and nearly dropped the sword from his shaking hands. But he steadied himself and stood tall against the raging storm and wailing wind. The youth walked towards the great double doors, sword in hand, with a confidence heretofore unknown to himself. When he stood in the darkened entryway, Finlay MacDonagh readied himself for what he faced outside. Lightning flashed and lit up the room. He saw for a moment his own blue eyes reflected in the steel blade, saw an alien hate in those shards of ice. The youth was animated, possessed by a fury not his own. Something twisted inside of him, and he began to despise the thing in the woods. He was no longer afraid. Why should he be? Finlay knew at that moment that he had killed this woman before, and he could do it again. With that faith in blood and steel, Finlay MacDonagh shouldered his claymore, and for the first time in centuries, kicked down the doors of the castle by the lock, ready for bloodshed. The vast grounds of Castle MacDonagh spread out into the impenetrable blackness of midnight. The perfectly cut stone had been torn up by the storm, and ancient gargoyles twisted in the roiling wind. The perfectly still and tamed courtyard had been built with meticulous care, and corrupted by one night of nature, usurping the proper sovereignty of man. The civility he had brought to this land had been defied, and there, in the center of his land, on the circle of stone that his descendants had raised up, Finlay MacDonagh saw the culprit standing alone and defiant. Her white nightgown bore the bloody marks of her first rebellion, and the youth flashed the vicious grin of his ancestors at the sight. He ran forward through the driving rain and towards his supposed antagonist, ignoring the shooting pain in his leg, and with the point of his claymore aimed forward. Finlay moved towards his target with the precision of the lightning that arced above him. His feet sunk into the soft, wet earth, and the winds wailed as he drew nearer to the blooded woman. The closer he came, the more he could see of the figure. Finlay saw the dried blood caked across her midsection, the dirt caked behind her nails, and the gash across her neck. Through everything, though, it was the look on the woman's face that finally stopped Finley in his tracks. He saw the world as it should have been in her dark eyes, set deep in a porcelain facade. He saw a little farm sitting on the cliff by the loch. He saw a couple living within, tending the herds of sheep through the long years. He saw then generations in a single moment. He saw the couple's children playing in the wild heather and among the sentinel pines. He saw their children's children continuing in the same fashion. Then the vision was snatched from him, and Finley saw only the specter, dead eyes lit only by the sorrow for what would never be, cold purple lips, mouthing a wordless scream in the face of this unbearable future. The spirit of spite and hatred within Finley marshaled a final attempt at control. The voice of heredity shrieked over the wailing wind. It told the youth that this was his land, his hard-won home, his birthright. He gripped the sword's hilt, but it only took one thought of that awful, cold castle to shatter the spirit's charge. Years of neglect and abuse bore down on the youth, with a force greater than the hurricane winds. He thought of the grand fireplace, cold and empty of a hearth fire for as long as he could remember. He remembered his parents, his father, callous and cold as any MacDonagh. He thought of his mother, cast out and locked away before her time. Finley remembered her words to him. He put his faith in that consolation and looked back into the pitiless black eyes of the woman in the night. He looked for compassion. He wanted to find leniency there and hoped for forgiveness. But the woman found none of that. There was only grief, anger, and despair in that specter. Finley thought of the castle that lay behind him, that massive, cancerous growth upon the land. He thought of what his family had taken from the woman, the generations that his ancestor had slaughtered on that one terrible night. Finley MacDonagh allowed the claymore to fall from his hands, and he went to his knees. The shrieking winds and lashing rain no longer plagued him. Not even the ghastly apparition that stood mere feet in front of him seemed wrong anymore. How could there be anything else in a place like this? This castle had been built on foundations of blood and bone, its stone hewn from stolen land, and its impunity reposed upon a soil that did not want it. In such a place, there was room for nothing but lamentation. Nothing good could grow here. Finley knew that now. Not until the corruption had been rooted out completely. Finley MacDonagh was left alone again. His only companions the ghosts of the past, the wailing of the wind in the woods, and the work that was still to be done. Fire and steel had started all this, and by fire it would end. He would make sure of it. The storm raged until dawn, and when the sun's light found Castle MacDonagh that morning, it found it in ruin. The fire had burned for hours, consuming stone and timber alike. Everyone for miles around the old castle had seen the blaze burning a red mar into the skyline, despite the driving rain. But no emergency crew could hope to reach the place until well after the storm had receded, and the many downed trees had been cleared from the country roads. The firemen and the police found nothing. No fire to fight, no people to save. There were signs of a young heir at the site. The young man's rental car was later found abandoned in front of the airport entrance. But Finley MacDonagh himself was never seen in Scotland again. Almost nothing was left at all. The castle was gone, burned inexplicably to the ground. The devastation was almost total. The monstrous old castle had been wiped from the cliffside, No wreckage stood testament to what had been done the previous night. There was only the stone foundation, sturdy and unrelenting in its hold on the earth. The castle was gone, but what was started in the black of night would not be so easily finished. The blood would not be washed from the grasping rocks so easily. After long centuries, the clearing on the cliff by the loch was left empty of that monument to domination. All that remained were memories of long-forgotten sins, the bones still entombed in the foundations, and the keening in the woods. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.